The ground in Russia is literally melting away. Across Siberia, entire cities are sinking as permafrost, soil that's been frozen for thousands of years, turns to mud beneath them. Buildings collapse, roads buckle and split, railway lines warp like toys in the sun. In Norilsk, Russia's northernmost city, over 60% of structures now show critical damage, with families being evacuated from their homes in the middle of the night as foundations crumble beneath them. But that's not even the most terrifying part. It's already too late to stop it. While the world focuses on Russia's war in Ukraine, an existential crisis is silently unfolding across 77% of Russian territory. Siberia alone, about 1.12 times larger than the combined size of the United States and Mexico, is at the heart of this crisis. The Siberian curse isn't some future threat. It's here now, rapidly dismantling what was once considered a superpower from within. And what you're about to discover about Russia's true vulnerability will fundamentally change how you see this supposed global power. So what exactly is the Siberian curse? It's the brutal geographic reality that Russia's greatest asset, its vast territory, is actually its deadliest liability. Russia spans 11 time zones, with much of its landmass situated in some of the harshest, coldest regions on Earth. According to recent analyses, maintaining basic infrastructure in Siberia costs significantly more, around 3 to 5 times than it does in Western Russia. And as climate change accelerates, thawing permafrost and extreme weather are driving those costs beyond what even a stable Russian economy could sustain. But if you think that's bad, what's coming next is even worse. Despite encompassing approximately 17.1 million square kilometers, the largest country on Earth, only about 7.4% of Russia's land is arable. The rest is either too cold, too remote, or increasingly unstable as the permafrost melts. And this brings us to the first deadly component of the Siberian curse. Climate change is hitting Russia harder than almost anywhere else on Earth, according to research published by Russia's own Ministry of Natural Resources in October 2024. Average temperatures across Russia are rising 2.5 times faster than the global average. In Siberia specifically, it's warming nearly 4 times faster. The consequences are already visible from space. NASA satellite imagery from 2024 shows permafrost thaw has created more than 7,000 new lakes across Siberia in just the last 5 years. That's not gradual change. That's geographical collapse happening in real time. But the real catastrophe lies beneath the surface. Siberia's permafrost contains an estimated 1.6 trillion tons of carbon, twice the amount currently in our atmosphere. As it thaws, this carbon is released primarily as carbon dioxide, but also as methane, a greenhouse gas 28 times more potent than CO2. Russia's own scientists at the Melnikov Permafrost Institute now predict that by 2030, permafrost thaw could be releasing more greenhouse gases annually than all of the European Union's emissions combined. So Russia isn't just a victim of climate change, it's becoming one of its primary accelerants. Talk about a vicious cycle. If you think that's ironic, wait till you hear this next part. Russia is one of the few countries that could theoretically benefit from a warming world, longer growing seasons in Siberia, new shipping routes through the Arctic, access to previously unreachable resources. Yet, in a twist of geopolitical fate, Russia can't capitalize on any of these potential benefits because its infrastructure is literally falling apart faster than it can be rebuilt. Let's talk about numbers. According to a 2024 assessment by Russia's Ministry of Construction, over 40% of all buildings in permafrost regions are showing signs of structural damage due to ground instability. In cities like Yakutsk, the world's coldest major city, that figure climbs to nearly 60%. The costs are staggering. Russia's own finance ministry estimates that permafrost-related infrastructure damage will cost at least $97 billion by 2050. But here's the shocking truth they're hiding. Internal government assessments leaked to Russian business newspaper Kommersant in January 2025 suggest the actual figure could exceed $250 billion. That's roughly 15% of Russia's entire GDP, just to keep existing infrastructure from collapsing. And what about building new infrastructure? That's where the Siberian curse truly reveals its devastating power. You see, after Western sanctions crippled Russia's access to European markets, Putin made a dramatic pivot east. "We'll develop Siberia," he declared in May 2024, announcing what he called the New Development of Siberia Mega Project, a supposed 21st century parallel to the Trans-Siberian Railway. The plan sounded impressive: new industrial centers, transportation corridors, and energy infrastructure across Siberia and the Russian Far East, creating a new economic geography that would make Russia independent from Western markets. There was just one problem, one giant, insurmountable problem that makes Russia's eastern pivot doomed to fail: distance. Unlike Americans who built their coast-to-coast transportation networks across relatively hospitable terrain, Russians face a far more daunting challenge. The distances in Siberia are mind-boggling, and the conditions are brutal. Building a highway in Siberia costs up to 7 times more than in central Russia due to permafrost engineering requirements. Operating railways cost up to 5 times more, and maintaining any infrastructure means battling temperature ranges that can swing 80 degrees Celsius between summer and winter. But that's just the beginning of Russia's geographic nightmare. Russia's economic geography is fundamentally broken. Its major population centers are separated from each other by thousands of kilometers of barely habitable land. Its industrial heartland is in the west, far from its resource wealth in the east. And connecting these distant regions requires infrastructure that is increasingly vulnerable to climate change. How bad is it? In February 2024, Russia's Federal Service for Hydrometeorology and Environmental Monitoring reported that permafrost degradation was progressing substantially faster than predicted, with some regions seeing thaw depths increase by over 30% in just 5 years. Emergency repair costs for railways, roads, and pipelines in Siberia have tripled since 2020. The situation is so dire that in July 2024, a section of the Baikal-Amur main line, a critical railway connecting Russia's Far East with its western regions, had to be completely rebuilt after permafrost thaw caused rails to shift by nearly 2 meters. The repairs took 3 months and cost over $50 million for just 12 kilometers of track. But wait, doesn't Russia have vast natural resources in Siberia? Isn't that its economic salvation? That's what Putin is betting on, but here's the brutal reality. Russia's resource wealth is increasingly a mirage. The easier-to-access deposits have already been exploited. What remains is in remote, hostile environments where extraction costs are skyrocketing due to climate instability. Take oil and gas, the backbone of Russia's economy. According to Russia's Ministry of Energy, production costs for new Siberian oil fields are up to 4 times higher than those in western Siberia, where production is already declining. Worse yet, as permafrost thaws, existing pipelines are at growing risk of rupture. In 2024 alone, Russia's state environmental watchdog recorded over 100 significant oil spills from damaged Siberian infrastructure, a 40% increase from 2023. Each one costs millions to clean up, if they're addressed at all. The most dramatic example occurred in May 2024 when a pipeline in the Khanty-Mansi region ruptured after ground subsidence, spilling over 20,000 tons of crude oil into the surrounding ecosystem. The cleanup operation is still ongoing, with estimated cost already exceeding $150 million. But the resource mirage goes beyond fossil fuels. Russia claims to have among the world's largest reserves of critical minerals needed for the green transition: nickel, copper, platinum, palladium, and rare earth elements, the kind of resources that should make Russia indispensable to the global economy. Yet, in a telling example of the Siberian curse in action, these resources remain largely untapped because the cost of extraction and transportation from remote Siberian locations make them uncompetitive on global markets. What's especially alarming for Russia's future is the collapse of its ambitious Arctic development plans. In January 2025, Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation responsible for developing the Northern Sea Route, reported that shipping volumes along the Arctic Passage had fallen by 18% year-over-year, despite projections of rapid growth. The reason? Unpredictable ice conditions caused by climate change, making shipping schedules impossible to maintain, even with Russia's nuclear icebreaker fleet. Russian officials had projected that the Northern Sea Route would handle 80 million tons of cargo by 2024, but actual volumes reached just 36 million tons, less than half the target. The shortfall represents not just an economic disappointment, but a strategic failure in Russia's attempt to create a viable alternative to traditional shipping routes through the Suez Canal. And just when you thought Russia's geographic problems couldn't get worse, they do. Perhaps the most underreported aspect of Russia's Siberian crisis is this: people are leaving, and they're not coming back. The population of Siberia and the Russian Far East has been shrinking for decades. But recent data from Russia's Federal State Statistics Service shows this decline accelerating dramatically. Since 2022, the population of Russia's eastern regions has decreased by nearly 500,000 people, about 3% of the total. Young people in particular are fleeing for Western Russia or leaving the country entirely. The average age in Siberian cities is now over 44 years, significantly higher than Russia's already concerning national average of 40.5 years. This demographic disaster creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Fewer people means less economic activity. Less economic activity means fewer jobs. Fewer jobs accelerates population decline. And all of this happens while the cost of maintaining basic infrastructure keeps rising. In the town of Vorkuta, once a thriving coal mining center in Russia's Arctic, the population has fallen from 115,000 in 1989 to under 50,000 today. Entire neighborhoods have been abandoned, with buildings left to crumble as the ground beneath them falls. In 2024, the local government announced plans to demolish over 100 empty apartment buildings because it could no longer afford to maintain them. This pattern is repeating across Siberia, a slow-motion collapse that Putin's government seems powerless to stop. But here's where the Siberian curse truly becomes an existential threat to Russia's future. It's undermining the country's military capabilities at the precise moment when Putin needs them most. With Russia bogged down in Ukraine and increasingly isolated internationally, maintaining control over its vast territory is more important than ever for the Kremlin. But how do you defend a territory that's literally falling apart? The Russian military is struggling with this very question. According to a 2024 report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Russia now spends approximately 7% of its defense budget just maintaining military installations in permafrost regions, money that could otherwise go toward weapons, training, or operations in Ukraine. More troubling for Putin, the infrastructure linking Russia's western military districts with its eastern ones is increasingly vulnerable. The Trans-Siberian Railway, critical for moving troops and equipment across the country, experienced over 30 major disruptions due to permafrost-related issues in 2024 alone, according to Russian Railways' own data. These aren't just inconveniences, they're strategic vulnerabilities that compromise Russia's ability to defend its eastern territories, particularly as China's influence in the region grows. What might shock you even more is how Russia's military planning is being directly compromised by climate change. In September 2024, satellite imagery revealed that Russia's Northern Fleet submarine base at Kajievo was experiencing unprecedented shore erosion due to permafrost thaw, threatening critical nuclear submarine facilities. According to naval analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, the Russian Navy has already been forced to reduce operations at the base while emergency stabilization work is carried out, a direct hit to Russia's nuclear deterrence capabilities. What you're about to find out next explains why China might be the biggest beneficiary of Russia's Siberian nightmare. After being cut off from Western capital and technology, Russia turned to China for investment in Siberian development projects, one-sided. Chinese companies now control significant stakes in key Siberian resource extraction operations, often securing prices well below market rates. A perfect example is the Tamtur rare earth deposit project in the Sakha Republic, one of the world's largest and richest rare earth element deposits, crucial for everything from electric vehicles to missile guidance systems. In November 2024, Putin personally scolded the operators of Tamtur for development delays, calling the situation unacceptable. What he didn't mention was that Russia lacks both the capital and technology to develop the deposit independently. The Chinese companies that could help are demanding ownership stakes of up to 70%, effectively transferring control of this strategic resource to Beijing. This is the Siberian curse in its starkest form. Russia controls vast natural wealth but cannot extract it without becoming dependent on others, undermining the very sovereignty Putin claims to be defending. If you think that's bad, the environmental crisis unfolding is even more shocking. In August 2024, Siberia experienced its most severe wildfire season on record, with over 21.7 million acres, 8.8 million hectares, burned, an area roughly the size of Portugal. Fighting these fires cost an estimated $3 billion, draining resources that could have gone toward infrastructure maintenance or economic development. In July 2020, the Siberian city of Norilsk, home to some of Russia's most important nickel and palladium mining operations, recorded temperatures of 32 degrees Celsius, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 18 degrees above historical averages. The heat caused permafrost thaw that damaged buildings, roads, and industrial facilities, temporarily halting production at several mining sites. These are not isolated incidents. They're the new normal in a rapidly warming Siberia, and Russia's ability to adapt is severely constrained by its strained finances, technological isolation, and the sheer scale of the challenge. But perhaps the most alarming development of all is the emergence of what scientists call zombie fires, wildfires that smolder underground in peat soils throughout the winter only to re-emerge in spring. In 2024, Russian emergency services documented over 150 such fires, consuming resources and threatening communities in ways that were virtually unknown a decade ago. Then there are the craters, massive holes suddenly appearing in the Siberian landscape as methane gas, trapped for millennia in the permafrost, explosively releases. The largest discovery in 2024 in the Yamal Peninsula measured over 50 meters in diameter and 30 meters deep, large enough to swallow a small apartment building. Scientists fear these craters will become increasingly common as permafrost thaw accelerates, posing unpredictable risks to infrastructure and human settlements. In March 2024, one such crater formed just 700 meters from a major gas pipeline, prompting emergency measures to prevent a potentially catastrophic explosion. But if you think environmental disasters are the worst of it, the health crisis unfolding across Siberia will make you think again. As permafrost thaws, it's releasing more than just carbon. Scientists have discovered ancient bacteria and viruses, some dormant for tens of thousands of years, being reactivated as the ground warms. In summer 2024, an outbreak of anthrax in the Yamal Peninsula infected 21 people and killed over 2,500 reindeer after the pathogen was released from thawing permafrost. Russian health authorities are now monitoring over 400 sites across Siberia where similar zombie pathogens might emerge. Even more alarming is what's happening to Siberia's water supply. A 2024 study by Moscow State University found that permafrost thaw is releasing unprecedented levels of mercury and other heavy metals into Siberian water systems. In the Lena River Basin, home to over 2 million people, mercury concentrations have increased by 300% since 2010, creating what researchers called a slow-motion public health disaster. The economic costs of these emerging health crises are immense. According to Russia's Ministry of Health, medical expenditures in Siberian regions increased by 47% between 2020 and 2024, primarily due to conditions linked to environmental degradation. With Russia's healthcare system already strained by sanctions limiting access to Western medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, this additional burden comes at the worst possible time. And that's not just a humanitarian concern, it's a demographic time bomb. Russia's population is already shrinking nationwide, but in Siberia, the combination of outmigration and deteriorating health conditions is creating what demographers call a population collapse spiral. Some remote Siberian communities have lost up to 40% of their residents in just the last decade. Many of those leaving are doctors, engineers, and other professionals whose skills are essential for maintaining infrastructure and public services. This brings us to another dimension of the Siberian curse that's rarely discussed: its devastating impact on Russia's indigenous people. Siberia is home to dozens of indigenous groups whose traditional ways of life are intimately connected to the land. As permafrost thaws and ecosystems transform, these communities are losing not just their livelihoods, but their entire cultural identity. Take the Nenets people of the Yamal Peninsula. For centuries, they've practiced reindeer herding across stable tundra landscapes. Now, new lakes and unstable ground are fragmenting migration routes that have existed for generations. According to a 2024 survey by the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, over 60% of Nenets herders report that climate change has made traditional herding patterns impossible to maintain. The Russian government's response? Resettle these communities into urban centers, effectively ending cultural traditions that have survived for millennia. This forced urbanization is creating new social problems, from alcoholism to unemployment, further straining local resources and healthcare systems. But perhaps the most immediate threat to Russia's territorial integrity comes from the rapid deterioration of its border infrastructure. Russia shares a 4,300-kilometer border with China, much of it running through Siberia. Maintaining this border has always been challenging, but climate change is making it nearly impossible in some regions. Border posts are sinking into thawing ground. Surveillance systems are failing as power infrastructure collapses, and patrol roads are becoming seasonally impassable. According to a classified report leaked to independent Russian news outlet Meduza in October 2024, Russia's Federal Security Service has identified over 300 kilometers of the Chinese border where effective surveillance and control can no longer be guaranteed due to infrastructure deterioration. The report described these areas as functionally porous, suggesting that Russia's ability to monitor and control movement across its borders is compromised. This border vulnerability creates both security and sovereignty concerns. With China's growing economic presence in the Russian Far East, many Russian security analysts fear a gradual erosion of Moscow's effective control over these regions, not through military invasion, but through economic penetration and demographic change. Chinese businesses already dominate many local economies in the Russian Far East. In cities like Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, Chinese investment accounts for over 60% of new commercial development. Chinese workers are increasingly filling labor shortages as Russians leave. And Chinese farmers now lease over 500,000 hectares of Russian agricultural land, a figure that has doubled since 2020. This economic dependency comes with political implications. Local officials in Siberian regions are increasingly looking to Beijing rather than Moscow for development funding and infrastructure support. A 2024 survey of regional administrators in the Russian Far East found that 68% had made official visits to China in the past year, compared to just 31% who have traveled to Moscow. For Putin, whose political legitimacy rests heavily on his image as a defender of Russian sovereignty, this gradual loss of control over Russia's eastern territories represents a profound threat, one that military power cannot easily address. What might be the most alarming development for Moscow came in April 2025, when authorities in the Primorsky Krai region signed a direct agreement with China's Heilongjiang province for cross-border infrastructure development without first securing approval from federal authorities. The agreement, which included plans for 3 new border crossings and a joint economic zone, was officially justified as emergency economic measures. But Moscow insiders saw it as something far more concerning: the beginning of regional authorities bypassing the Kremlin entirely in their dealings with China. So what does all this mean for Russia's future? The Siberian Curse is creating a perfect storm that threatens to accelerate Russia's decline as a global power. The cost of maintaining Siberia are rising, just as Russia's income is falling due to sanctions and the global energy transition. Its population is shrinking and aging, particularly in the regions that hold its greatest resource wealth. And climate change is damaging infrastructure faster than it can be repaired, let alone expanded. This isn't just an environmental crisis or an economic challenge. It's an existential threat to Russia as we know it. Russian officials understand this better than they publicly admit. In private meetings reported by Russian business daily Vedomosti in December 2024, senior government figures discussed scenarios where parts of eastern Siberia might effectively become administratively autonomous due to Moscow's inability to maintain meaningful control. Such an admission would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Today, it reflects the growing recognition within Russia's ruling circles that the Siberian Curse might be inescapable. For a country whose identity is so deeply tied to its territorial vastness, the prospect of losing effective control over much of that territory represents a profound psychological as well as strategic blow. It strikes at the very core of Russian exceptionalism, the belief that Russia's unique geography and destiny set it apart from other nations. What makes this situation particularly devastating for Putin's government is that it exposes the fundamental contradictions in Russia's national narrative. For decades, Russian leaders have boasted about their country's boundless natural resources and territorial expanse. Now, those same features are becoming liabilities that undermine Russia's power rather than enhance it. The most shocking evidence of this came in April 2024 when leaked minutes from a closed-door meeting of Russia's Security Council revealed that officials are now considering the unthinkable, the possibility of voluntary territorial consolidation, effectively abandoning direct governance of some remote Siberian regions to focus resources on more viable areas. The bitter irony is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, ostensibly launched to expand Russian territory and influence, has accelerated these internal geographic threats by straining the country's finances, isolating it technologically, and diverting resources that could have gone toward addressing the Siberian crisis. As permafrost continues to thaw, as infrastructure continues to crumble, as people continue to leave, and as Russia's ability to respond continues to weaken, the Siberian Curse will only tighten its grip. The world's largest country is caught in a geographic trap of its own making, facing challenges that cannot be resolved through military force or political repression, Putin's preferred tools. No amount of nationalist rhetoric or great power nostalgia can refreeze the permafrost or make Siberia's vast distances disappear. This is the reality that Russia's leaders desperately try to obscure with geopolitical aggression and nuclear saber-rattling. But while the world's attention is fixed on Russia's external actions, the country is literally melting from within. The Siberian Curse isn't just threatening Russia, it's killing it, one thawing kilometer at a time. So what do you think? Is Russia's geographic predicament truly inescapable? Could technological breakthroughs or political reforms alter this trajectory? Or are we witnessing the beginning of the end for Russia as a unified state? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And make sure you watch how vodka destroyed Russia and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. They drilled 3,280 feet into Chinese soil and exposed a collapse Xi Jinping can't cover up. It wasn't oil, it wasn't gold, it was proof that China is dying of thirst. Beneath the factories, the farms, the megacities lies devastation. Aquifers emptied, groundwater poisoned, land sinking, cities cracking. This isn't speculation, it's science. Xi's own hydrologists now admit Beijing's water table has fallen by hundreds of feet. Entire regions are collapsing into hollow ground, and no amount of propaganda can refill what's been drained. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party built an empire on borrowed water. Now, the debt is coming due. This drill didn't just expose the earth, it pierced the illusion and hid the truth. And that truth? China's greatest threat isn't foreign invasion, it's what's missing under its own feet. Let's dig into what Beijing doesn't want you to see and what's already too late to stop. Picture this: 28,000 rivers, gone, vanished in just 25 years, erased from the map. Rivers that sustained Chinese civilization for millennia simply ceased to exist. In some villages, elderly residents tell stories of rivers where they swam as children, where they caught fish, where communities gathered. Their grandchildren have never seen water flow there, not once. The riverbed is just cracked dirt now, a gray scar cutting through the landscape. The Yellow River, the mother river of Chinese civilization, where the first dynasties emerged 5,000 years ago, now flows at barely 10% of what it carried in the 1940s. Entire stretches run completely dry for months at a time. Where fishing boats once crowded the waters, where trade barges carried goods between cities, there's nothing but cracked earth stretching into the horizon. Riverbeds that carried the lifeblood of dynasties now look like lunar landscapes, gray, lifeless, dead. And here's what's happening right now in cities across northern China. Hotels ration water to 1 hour per day. 1 hour to shower, wash your hands, brush your teeth, live. Not in some remote rural village, in major cities across the nation that calls itself a superpower. Business travelers check into hotels and find notices posted, water available 7 to 8 a.m. only. After that, taps run dry until the next morning. This is the reality in a country that built entire megacities from nothing in under a decade. Beijing, the gleaming capital, seat of communist power, has water availability of just 250 cubic meters per person annually. That's half the threshold the UN defines as extreme scarcity. The kind of number you'd expect from desert nations in the Middle East, not from the capital of the world's second largest economy. It's less water per person than many residents of Saudi Arabia have access to. Let that sink in. Let that sink in for a moment. But it's not just Beijing. 12 provinces covering 41% of China's population now face severe water shortages. These aren't empty wastelands on the edges of the empire. These regions produce 38% of China's agricultural output, 46% of industrial production, half the nation's electricity generation. The engine of Chinese power, the factories, the farms, the infrastructure that built China's rise is running on vapors. So here's the question everyone should be asking. How are millions of faucets still running? How do factories operate? How does life continue? The answer lies underground, and it's terrifying. When the rivers began dying, China turned desperate. They drilled, and when shallow wells ran dry, they drilled deeper still. Wells that once tapped water at 30 meters, about the height of a 10-story building, now plunge hundreds of meters down. Some go over a kilometer deep, drilling through solid bedrock to reach ancient aquifers formed during the Ice Age. Fossil water that accumulated drop by drop over tens of thousands of years while mammoths still walked the earth and humans lived in caves. Water that was never supposed to be touched. Emergency reserves that should have been saved for the direst scenarios imaginable. China has been draining it for decades, treating ancient geological wealth like an infinite resource. Beijing's own government admits 2/3 of its provinces are over-extracting groundwater. When you hear that phrase, over-extracting, what it really means is this: pumping water out faster than rainfall and rivers can possibly refill it. Mining water like it's coal, treating a renewable resource as if it's disposable. And when a regime that habitually covers up disasters and censors bad news publicly confesses to a crisis of this magnitude, you know the situation has already spiraled far beyond control. Some regions are tapping what officials call deep groundwater, reserves so far down that accessing them was never part of any sane water management plan. These are supposed to be emergency supplies, last resort reserves for civilization-ending scenarios. China touched them in the 1980s and never stopped. Now those reserves are running dry too. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. 60 billion cubic meters of groundwater vanish every single year. To put that in perspective, that's enough water to fill Lake Erie. Every year, gone, pumped out and consumed, and leaving hollow spaces in the earth where life-sustaining water once sat. This isn't sustainable water use. This isn't even unsustainable water use. This is water theft on a geological scale, systematically robbing the future to pay for the present. A 2025 study analyzing Chinese cities revealed that 180 of them face critical groundwater depletion or contamination crises, affecting over 311 million urban residents. That's close to the entire population of the United States living above aquifers that are collapsing or poison, or both. In parts of the North China Plain, China's agricultural heartland, water tables drop 1 to 3 meters every single year. Wells drilled last year don't reach water this year. Farmers watch their irrigation systems sputter and fail. Ancient lakes shrink to toxic puddles ringed with dead fish. Wetlands that sustain migratory birds for millennia turn to cracked mud and dust. But you haven't heard the worst part yet. When you pump water out of the ground, you're not just removing liquid, you're removing the physical support structure holding up everything above it. The soil particles that were suspended in water, held apart by that moisture, start compacting. The ground settles, compresses, sinks, and China is sinking fast. A 2024 satellite study using advanced radar monitoring over 7 years revealed something that should be headline news everywhere. 45% of China's major urban areas are subsiding faster than 3 millimeters per year. 16% are dropping more than 10 millimeters annually. That means 270 million people, more than a quarter of China's urban population, are literally living on land that's falling beneath their feet as you watch this. Beijing's Shaoyang district, packed with gleaming skyscrapers, underground subway networks, vital infrastructure, drops 45 millimeters per year near major transit lines. That's nearly 2 inches of vertical ground loss every 12 months. Roads crack and buckle under the strain of shifting earth. Building foundations settle unevenly, creating structural problems that compound with each passing year. High-speed rail lines warp slightly out of alignment, requiring constant monitoring, adjustment, and expensive repairs. In some districts of Beijing, the ground has fallen 11 centimeters in a single year, more than 4 inches of vertical drop that's enough to cause visible, measurable damage to buildings and critical infrastructure. Imagine your entire city sinking 4 inches while you live there. Most residents don't even realize it's happening until the cracks appear. Shanghai, the crown jewel of Chinese economic power, the city that symbolizes China's rise on the global stage, has subsided over 3 meters since industrialization began a century ago. 3 meters, 10 feet of vertical drop. The city that's supposed to represent China's future is literally collapsing into the earth beneath its own weight, inch by inch, year by year. And it's not just Shanghai. Tianjin, Guangzhou, Ningpu, Fuzhou, all major coastline megacities housing millions, are experiencing the same fate. By 2120, researchers project that 22 to 26% of China's coastal lands will sit below sea level, not from climate change and rising oceans alone, though that's certainly accelerating the crisis, but from the ground itself sinking like the hull of a torpedoed ship slowly going under. Between 55 and 128 million people could end up living in what becomes permanent flood zones. Think about that number. That's more than the population of most countries on Earth, trapped in cities that sit below sea level, vulnerable to every storm surge, every typhoon, every spring tide. Cities that took decades to build, trillions of yuan to develop, could become effectively unlivable in less than a century. Across the countryside, dramatic sinkholes are swallowing fields, roads, houses, and entire buildings without warning. These aren't natural karst formations. They're man-made disasters triggered by groundwater extraction undermining the Earth's structure. The ground becomes hollow like a dried sponge, and then one day, without any warning, it simply collapses. A farmer walks across his field in the morning and the ground opens up beneath him, revealing a cavern that hadn't been there the day before. A section of highway drops 6 feet overnight, stranding vehicles. Buildings tilt and crack as the soil beneath their foundations gives way. Over 60,000 square kilometers of Chinese land, an area larger than the entire nation of Taiwan, has experienced measurable subsidence. The damage already cost China an estimated 7.5 billion yuan annually in infrastructure repairs, compensation, and emergency responses. And that's just what Beijing admits to. The real number is certainly higher. But here's the part Xi Jinping absolutely cannot hide, no matter how much the party tries to censor it. When those engineers drilled 3,280 feet down into Chinese soil, they didn't just find emptiness. They found poison. 80% of China's groundwater wells show contamination when tested. The Lowy Institute, analyzing data from multiple sources, estimates that 80 to 90% of China's groundwater is now unsuitable for drinking without extensive treatment. But it gets worse. 50% of China's groundwater is so toxic that you cannot even use it to irrigate crops. Read that again. Half of the groundwater beneath the world's most populous nation is so contaminated that plants watered with it would absorb toxins. Official government surveys, the ones Beijing cannot suppress without completely destroying any remaining credibility, confirm the nightmare. China's Ministry of Environmental Protection found that 60% of monitored groundwater in cities was classified as seriously contaminated, unfit for human consumption, dangerous even with treatment. Only a tiny fraction of tested wells returned results that qualified as genuinely clean. The Pearl River Delta, one of China's most economically vital regions, provides a case study in catastrophe. Scientists drilled deep and extracted groundwater samples for laboratory analysis. What they found should shock anyone paying attention. Arsenic concentrations reaching 161 micrograms per liter. The World Health Organization's safety guideline is 10 micrograms per liter. This water was 16 times over the safe threshold. Drinking water contaminated above 50 micrograms per liter can cause cognitive development damage in children. At 161 micrograms, it's not just unsafe, it's slow-motion poisoning spreading through an entire economic region that houses tens of millions of people. Professor John A. Cherry, one of Canada's leading hydrogeologists who spent years studying China's groundwater crisis firsthand, delivered a chilling assessment in 2016. Up to 80% of water sources in some rural areas may be genuinely unsafe. Farmers across these regions know their irrigation water is contaminated. They can see it, smell it sometimes, watch what happens to their skin when they work in the fields all day. But they have no choice. They use it anyway because there's no alternative. Growing vegetables and rice they themselves refuse to eat. The produce goes to local markets, enters the food supply chain, gets transported to cities, and some of it gets exported internationally. The toxins keep spreading through the system. How did this happen? How does the world's most tightly controlled society allow its most fundamental resource to become poisoned on this scale? One word: corruption. For decades, really since Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms began in the 1980s, local governments prioritized economic growth above everything else. GDP numbers determined whether officials got promoted to Beijing or sidelined to irrelevance. Factories brought jobs, tax revenue, and proof of progress that Communist Party bosses demanded to see on paper. So factories dumped industrial waste into rivers at night when no one was watching. Chemical plants discharged toxins directly in the watersheds, turning entire rivers into chemical soups. Mining operations poison whole regions, leaving behind wastelands where nothing will grow for generations. Environmental officials looked the other way. Either they were bribed directly, or they understood perfectly well that shutting down major polluters would cost their region GDP points, tax revenue, and jobs, which meant it would cost them their careers, their party standing, maybe their freedom. Penalties for environmental violations were laughably small. A factory caught dumping might pay a fine equivalent to a few days' profit, then continue poisoning the water supply the very next week. As long as the factory kept employing workers and filling government coffers, it wasn't going to be shut down over something as seemingly minor as dumping carcinogens into aquifers that millions drink from. One Chinese environmental expert, speaking anonymously to overseas media because publicly criticizing the system in China can end careers, or worse, put it bluntly, water pollution in China is not technically hard to fix. We have the knowledge. We have the technology. It's politically hard to fix because the polluters and the officials don't want to change the status quo. They profit from it. But what's been happening underground over the past decade is even more sinister. Some Chinese industrial companies devised a method to hide pollution from environmental inspectors entirely, high-pressure injection of toxic wastewater directly into deep aquifers. Here's how it works. Using powerful industrial pumps, they drill boreholes down through the rock, sometimes a kilometer deep, 3,280 feet, the exact depth our opening drill reached, and inject concentrated toxic waste directly into deep geological formations that should never be contaminated. By backfilling poisonous effluent into aquifers that are hundreds of meters down, they hide the evidence completely. No visible pollution on the surface, no smell that neighbors can detect, no surface contamination that inspectors can easily find during routine checks. The waste simply disappears underground, out of sight and supposedly out of mind, until people start getting sick years later and can't figure out why. A 2013 field survey conducted by researchers from the Chinese Academy of Engineering uncovered this practice and estimated something almost unbelievable. 16 billion tons of industrial wastewater were being secretly dumped underground every single year. 16 billion tons! Those deep aquifers move extremely slowly. Water down there might take centuries or even millennia to flow and filter through rock layers. Contamination injected today will poison those zones for hundreds of years, perhaps forever. When groundwater moves that slowly, there's no natural cleansing process that can fix this kind of industrial-scale poisoning. When citizens in Shidang accused factories of underground injection, linking it to cancer spikes, online outcry forced investigations. Some arrests, a few plugged wells, but thousands of injection sites likely still operate, poisoning the water table. The human cost is staggering. Cancer villages have emerged, communities where cancer rates explode far above normal. The correlation with contaminated water is undeniable. State media eventually acknowledge the phenomenon, though they rarely investigate industrial causes. Rural health systems struggle with waterborne diseases. Diarrhea remains the leading cause of death among children under 5. And then there are the visual nightmares censorship can't hide. In 2012, the Yellow River turned blood red from chemical discharge. A Wenzhou River turned crimson overnight. Locals called it the Red River. Another ran bright yellow, reeking of industrial waste. Lake Taihu became fluorescent green algae soup in 2007, cutting off drinking water to millions. And then Shanghai, March 2013. Over 12,000 dead pig carcasses floated down the Huangpu River, a main water source for 23 million people. For days, bloated pig bodies bobbed past Shanghai's skyline. Farmers had dumped diseased livestock rather than dispose of them properly. The images went global. You can't censor thousands of pig corpses. Around that time, government reports admitted 200 million rural Chinese lacked safe drinking water. 200 million. Testing found cadmium contamination in rice from Hunan and Guangdong, staple food laced with heavy metals from polluted irrigation. And here's what should terrify everyone watching. China is one of the world's largest food exporters. Garlic, apple juice, fish, processed foods. If grown with contaminated water, these toxins don't respect borders. They end up in New York, London, Tokyo. Chinese seafood has been rejected by importers due to pollutant residues traced to polluted water sources. A 2018 Tsinghua study found water, soil, and air pollution form a vicious cycle. Water pollutes crops, contaminated soil leaches into groundwater, polluted air creates toxic rain. The poisons spread everywhere, reinforcing each other endlessly. So what happens when 1.4 billion people run out of clean water? Scholars estimate supply could fall short by 25% by 2030, 5 years away. A 25% deficit means systemic collapse, abandoned cities, mass migration, agricultural failure. The North China Plain, China's breadbasket, depends on groundwater for 60% of wheat and 45% of corn. Over 7.5 million wells drain ancient aquifers irrigating farmland nearly the size of Oklahoma. NASA satellites show between 2003 and 2010, North China lost groundwater equal to twice Beijing's annual consumption every year. If the North China Plain suffers a 33% crop loss, a plausible scenario, China would need to import 20% of globally traded corn and 13% of wheat. That would send global food prices skyrocketing. Poor nations would face immediate hunger. Geopolitical tensions would explode. And it's not just agriculture. China is the factory floor of the world. Those factories run on water. A severe drought affecting hydropower could knock out hundreds of terawatt hours, equivalent to entire nations' annual generation. That leaves coal, burning massive additional amounts, accelerating climate change, worsening air quality. The South-North Water Transfer Project, Xi's signature achievement meant to solve everything, is proving insufficient. At $70 billion, it's the largest water project ever attempted, but it's not enough. The transferred water costs 6 yuan per cubic meter. Local governments still drill free groundwater, sell it cheap, pocket the difference. The Grand Canal runs below capacity while officials drain the earth dry for profit. Beijing knows. In 2021, China enacted its first national groundwater regulation. Officials admitted over 20 provinces are overpumping, some tapping ultra-deep reserves that should never be touched. When a regime that covers up disasters admits publicly to catastrophe, it's already too late. Some progress has been made. Shanghai limited withdrawals, slowing subsidence. The water transfer stabilized Beijing's levels in some districts. Tokyo offers hope. Sank 15 feet but reversed it through strict pumping bans. But China has 1.4 billion people. The scale is incomprehensible. And unlike Tokyo, China's groundwater isn't just depleted, it's poisoned. You can pump water back into aquifers, but you cannot unpollute deep groundwater contaminated with industrial toxins. That's a generational problem, maybe civilizational. Xi Jinping can't hide this anymore. For all the party's control, they can't censor reality, can't stop rivers from dying, can't prevent ground from sinking, can't make poison wells safe by deleting posts. Nature rebels against the cover-up. When fish leap from polluted ponds choosing death, no propaganda explains it. When cameras capture blood-red rivers faster than censors delete them, truth gets out. Truth bubbles from 3,280 feet down carried in toxic groundwater that can't sustain 1.4 billion people. The drill exposed more than geology. It exposed the lie at China's heart. That growth can't continue forever. That resources are infinite. That party control extends over nature. It doesn't. Water is the source of life. If poisoned or dried up, civilizations cannot survive. For thousands of years, Chinese dynasties rose and fell with rivers. The Yellow River gave birth to Chinese civilization. When rivers failed, dynasties collapsed. Xi and the party knows this. It's why they've thrown billions at water projects, declared wars on pollution, passed regulations. But they're learning what every dynasty learned. You cannot defy hydrology through political will. The aquifers took tens of thousands of years to fill. China drained them in decades. No technology can fix this on the timeline they need. What happens next will reshape the century. If China cannot secure water, we'll witness the largest migration in human history. Agricultural collapse, supply chains breaking down. Food price spikes destabilizing governments. Commodity shortages, geopolitical instability on unprecedented scales. The drill that went 3,280 feet down didn't just find a water crisis, it found the future. Seeping through cracks in sinking cities, flowing from contaminated taps, absent from dried riverbeds that once sustained empires. Xi Jinping cannot bury this secret. The earth exposes the truth. One drained aquifer, one sinking city, one poison well. Water is life. China is running out of both. No propaganda can change that. So what do you think? Can China engineer its way out, or are we watching the collapse of a civilization built on borrowed water? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to stay ahead of the geopolitical stories shaping our world, subscribe to Fall of Nations.
Across Iran, something terrifying is happening. The ground itself is starting to collapse. Entire regions are slowly sinking, not by millimeters, but by tens of centimeters every year. Railways are warping, highways are cracking, cities are beginning to tilt and fracture. This isn't the aftermath of war, it's something far more permanent. For decades, Iran has been draining the underground aquifers that keep the country alive, pumping out tens of billions of cubic meters of water every year. And now the empty underground chambers that once held that water are collapsing. And when that happens, the damage can last centuries. even millennia. This isn't a military threat, it's a geological one, and it may ultimately do something that missiles never could. End Iran as we know it. Right now in 2026, we're watching it happen in real time. Let's start with the ground itself. Satellite surveys of Iran using high-resolution radar data reveal something extraordinary. Across vast stretches of this country, the surface is sinking, not settling, not shifting slightly, sinking. In some agricultural plains in the Kerman province, the land is dropping more than 35 centimeters in a single year. That's over a foot of vertical collapse annually. Sustained over a decade, that amounts to the Earth falling away by several meters. This phenomenon is called land subsidence, and what makes Iran's case so alarming is its sheer scale. A study published in Science Advances in 2024 found that approximately 56,000 square kilometers, roughly 3.5% of Iran's entire land area, is now affected. And within that zone, around 3,000 square kilometers are sinking faster than 10 centimeters per year. The Central Plateau alone hosts 2/3 of Iran's depleting aquifers, with some locations registering the fastest subsidence rates anywhere on Earth. You can see the consequences everywhere. Railway lines that cross Iran's central plains require constant repair because the earth beneath them has become uneven. Roads develop long fissures as the ground settles. Pipelines crack, water mains burst. Even Imam Khomeini International Airport, one of the busiest in the Middle East, is sinking at approximately 5 centimeters per year. In Tehran, engineers have identified 14 metro stations now at serious risk from the shifting ground beneath the city. This is what the collapse of a nation looks like, not through bombs or battles, but through the slow, silent failure of the earth itself. No explosion, no warning sign, just the ground, centimeter by centimeter, giving way. And the reason it's happening lies in something far deeper than war. For most of the 20th century, Iran had a strategy for surviving in one of the driest climates on Earth. Dig deeper. More wells, more pumps, more extraction. The logic was simple. If the rains don't come, go underground. And for a while, it did work. But the numbers behind what Iran has done to its own groundwater are staggering. Between 2002 and 2015 alone, Iran lost approximately 74 billion cubic meters of groundwater. That's not an annual figure, that is cumulative, but 74 billion cubic meters gone in just 13 years. And it continued after that. Scientists tracking Iran's total water storage loss estimate the country has depleted about 211 billion cubic meters over the last 2 decades. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to draining a body of water the size of the Caspian Sea to below half its volume. Gone. Permanently. At the peak of extraction, Iran was pulling between 60 and 75 billion cubic meters from underground aquifers every single year. The country was drilling more and more holes in the ground, desperate to keep the water flowing. Between 2002 and 2015, the number of groundwater extraction points nearly doubled, from around 546,000 to over 1 million. And despite all that drilling, the annual yield actually fell by 18%, because Iran had hit the physical limit. The aquifers were running out. By 2018, Iran's government was forced to classify 236 groundwater basins as prohibited, meaning no new wells were allowed, and another 127 as critical. Hundreds of Iran's underground water reserves were effectively broken. Today, 77% of Iran's land area is experiencing what scientists call extreme overdraft, when pumping rates exceed recharge rates so severely that the aquifer cannot recover on its own. The groundwater recharge rate, the pace at which the rain and rivers naturally replenish the aquifers, has also been declining. A Nature Communications study found a nationwide drop of nearly 4 millimeters per year in groundwater recharge. Iran is simultaneously draining faster and refilling slower. That combination has only one destination. This isn't drought. Droughts end. This is something Iran did to itself over decades. But numbers alone don't show the full scale of what's happening on the surface. There's a lake in northwest Iran called Lake Urmia. It was once one of the largest saltwater lakes in all of the world, a body of water so vast that it could be seen from space. In the late 1970s, it held more than 30 billion cubic meters of water. Flamingos nested on its shores. Entire ecosystems depended on it. Today, Lake Urmia is almost gone. Its volume has collapsed to less than 1 billion cubic meters. What once was a shimmering inland sea is now, in large part, a vast plain of salt. The lake bed blows toxic dust into the air. Farmland nearby has been poisoned. Communities that existed alongside that lake for generations are watching it vanish. Lake Urmia didn't disappear because of a natural disaster. It disappeared because Iran systematically diverted and drained the rivers and groundwaters that fed it. Dams were built upstream. Agricultural irrigation was expanded without limit. And the lake, once considered irreplaceable, was allowed to die. It's not alone. The Sayanda Rud River, which once ran through the heart of Isfahan, a city famous for its ancient gardens and canal-fed orchards, now runs completely dry for most of the year. The riverbed that once sustained one of Iran's most storied cities is now exposed dust. The famous bridges of Isfahan stand over nothing. In central Iran, rivers that sustained communities for centuries have turned to dust bowls. Wetlands in the south have collapsed entirely. The surface is just the visible part. The deeper damage is happening underground, in places you cannot see, until the ground beneath your feet gives way. And that's the most dangerous consequence of all. Think of an aquifer like a natural sponge buried beneath the earth. While it's full of water, that water supports the weight of the soil above. The grains of sand and clay are held apart by that water pressure. Remove the water, pump it out at a massive scale over decades, and those grains compress, the gaps collapse, and the sponge is permanently squeezed flat. That process is what's now tearing Iran's infrastructure apart from below. When the ground compresses unevenly, as it always does, because different regions pump at different rates, the earth above it doesn't sink uniformly. It warps, tilts, it fractures along invisible lines. Bridges that were once aligned begin to shift centimeters out of position, enough to halt rail traffic. Water mains crack open, sewage systems buckle, gas pipelines fracture, and above it all, the buildings, roads, and cities that Iranians built over decades are beginning to crack and lean. This is already happening across Iran's biggest population centers. In Tehran, groundwater levels have fallen by 12 meters over the past 2 decades. The capital is sinking. In Isfahan province, suburbs and villages are registering subsidence rates of 10 to 15 centimeters per year. In Khuzestan in the southwest, areas around Avaz are experiencing up to 30 centimeters of annual collapse in some zones. And here's what makes this so much more dangerous than any bomb. A missile strike that causes immediate visible damage that can be photographed, assessed, and then repaired. This destruction is invisible until it's irreversible. If you want to understand how nations collapse from forces that most people never see, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because the story unfolding beneath Iran may become one of the most important environmental collapses of the century. Now here's the part of this story that most people never hear, and it's the part that makes this different from every other crisis that we've covered on this channel. Iran's major aquifers are not fed primarily by rain. They're what geologists call fossil water, reserves that accumulated during a far wetter ancient climate thousands of years ago, when Iran's landscape looked completely different. These aren't underground pools that refill when it rains. They're geological formations that took millennia to build. Once collapsed, they don't come back on any human timescale. A landmark study by scientists at GFZ German Research Center for Geosciences, published in Science Advances in 2024, estimated that Iran is losing 1.7 billion cubic meters of groundwater per year from its confined aquifers alone. Water that cannot be replaced by rainfall. And replenishing that kind of structural deficit, scientists have warned, could take hundreds of years, if even possible at all. If even possible at all. To give that number some scale, 1.7 billion cubic meters every year gone permanently. That's equivalent to draining a medieval cathedral full of water every single minute of every day, and never being able to refill it. Year after year, decade after decade. We're not talking about waiting out a bad drought. We're talking about damage that could outlast the Islamic Republic itself. Damage that could outlast whatever comes after. Damage measured not in political cycles, but in geological time. Iran's own leading water scientists have begun using a term that was once theoretical, but now is frighteningly real. Water bankruptcy. Not a shortage, not a crisis, but bankruptcy. A point of no return. And the places where that bankruptcy is hitting hardest are the places where millions of Iranians live right now. By the summer of 2025, what had been a slow-burning catastrophe became a live emergency. Tehran, a capital of roughly 10 million people, was approaching day zero, the moment when the taps run dry. The 5 major dams supplying the city were sitting at an average of just 10% capacity. The Amir Kabir Dam, which once held over 200 million cubic meters of water, had collapsed to just 3%, its lowest level since the dam was built in 1963. The Latyan Dam was at 9%, the Mamlu Reservoir at 1%. The Lar Dam, which alone supplies parts of northern and eastern Tehran, was so depleted that officials stopped short of stating its level publicly. Iran's energy minister warned that supplies across the country could be cut off entirely at night. Then, the president of Iran said out loud what no one expected to hear. President Masoud Pezeshkian told his cabinet, "If it doesn't rain, we will have to ration water. And if it still doesn't rain, we may have to evacuate Tehran." Evacuate Tehran, a city of 10 million people, a capital that stood for centuries, abandoned not because of a foreign invasion, but because the ground it sits on no longer has water. This isn't a hypothetical either. Residents reported water flowing for only parts of the day. Nighttime shutoffs have become routine. Officials recommended that Iranians buy private pumps and storage tanks. Emergency public holidays were declared in Tehran province to reduce water and electricity consumption. And then the protests came. In May of 2025, demonstrations spread from universities across the country with a slogan that cut to the bone: water, electricity, life, our basic right. 62% of Tehran's water now comes from underground sources, and those sources are failing fast. The head of Iran's Water Industry Federation stated publicly, quote, "The level of these aquifers has dropped sharply. Water rationing should have started much earlier." But how did Iran reach this point? That answer goes to the heart of the country's political identity, and it isn't pretty. The disaster wasn't inevitable. Iran is an arid country, but it always was. For centuries, Iranians managed that aridity through one of the most elegant engineering systems in human history: the Qanat, ancient underground channels, some thousands of years old, that tapped groundwater slowly and sustainably, channeling it to cities and farms without ever depleting the aquifer below. It was a system built on understanding limits. Then came the modern era, and the destruction of those limits began. Starting in the 1960s and accelerating dramatically after the 1979 revolution, successive Iranian governments adopted the same strategy: build dams, dig wells, extract at maximum capacity. The ideology behind it was self-sufficiency, the belief that Iran could feed itself and defy international pressure by controlling its own water. The Islamic Republic declared agricultural independence a matter of national security. The result was one of the most aggressive water extraction programs in modern history. At its peak, Iran was one of the top 3 dam builders on Earth. Hundreds of dams were constructed, many on rivers too small to sustain them. The IRGC built over 60 dams in recent decades. More than half of those dams are now effectively empty. Rather than solving water scarcity, they accelerated evaporation, redirected water away from downstream ecosystems, and drove farmers to pump even harder from underground reserves. Today, agriculture consumes more than 90% of Iran's water withdrawals. That same sector accounts for only 12% of GDP and 14% of employment. And all that water poured into Iranian fields, well, roughly 60% is wasted through inefficient flood irrigation in the scorching heat. Iran consumes approximately 100 billion cubic meters of water per year, more than twice Turkey's usage for a similar population size. But the policy failures don't end there. They go somewhere far darker. Behind Iran's water catastrophe is not just bad planning, it's something more calculated. Iranian analysts have a name for the network responsible: the water mafia. Not a literal crime syndicate, but a web of government ministers, IRGC-linked contractors, and state institutions that have systematically profited from mega water projects. An Atlantic Council analysis described this network as driving unchecked dam building, wasteful water transfers, and relentless over-extraction. The logic is perverse, but consistent. The more severe the water crisis, the more justification for the next massive, expensive infrastructure contract. Crisis becomes profit. One example stands above the rest. The Gotvan Dam on the Karun River was built at enormous cost, and its reservoir filled with salt water. It cannot support agriculture. It's effectively useless. Iran's own former head of the Environment Department later admitted, "We made mistakes in the 1980s. In places we built dams we shouldn't have." The water crisis grew. The projects kept coming. And in October of 2025, as Tehran's reservoirs collapsed towards zero, President Pezeshkian announced that the capital may need to be relocated. The estimated cost would be somewhere between $77 and $100 billion. And who uniquely is positioned to build the new capital? Well, the same IRGC construction network that helped create the crisis in the first place. A regime that engineered its own catastrophe, now positioned to profit from the most expensive solution in Iranian history. But consequences of this aren't just economic, they're civilizational. In the summer of 2025, Iran's water crisis stopped being a policy debate and became a social eruption. Students at universities in Shiraz, Avaz, and Tabriz faced dormitories without running water in punishing heat. Farmers across Khuzestan, watching their irrigation systems fail, blocked roads and confronted authorities. In 2025, a wave of protests over water and electricity shortages spread from parched rural districts to mid-sized cities, which united farmers, workers, students, and families, all demanding basic services and denouncing what they called incompetent officials. The slogans heard across dozens of provinces was simple: water, electricity, life. The agricultural collapse is already underway. An estimated 1.3 million farmers have lost their livelihoods as water sources disappear. Up to 40 million people face acute food insecurity risk within a decade if current trends continue. Iran is in its sixth consecutive year of drought, compounding damage to infrastructure already broken from within. And Iran consumes roughly 100 billion cubic meters of water per year, nearly all of it going to an agricultural sector that's already on its knees. The system is not slowing down. It's accelerating toward its own end. And now the geopolitical pressure is escalating. Afghanistan, under Taliban control, has been building its own dams on the Helmand and Hararud rivers, cutting the flow of water that eastern Iran depends on. Mashhad, Iran's second largest city, is already feeling the strain. Water experts now openly discuss the possibility of Iran entering water conflicts with its neighbors. Not ideological confrontations, but existential ones. Wars not fought over land or ideology, but over survival. The guns and missiles dominate the headlines, but the story that geologists and hydrologists will be discussing for generations is already unfolding, silently, invisibly, beneath the surface of a country running out of time. Wars have always defined how the world sees Iran. Missiles, sanctions, regional power struggles, regime survival. Every news cycle about Iran is framed through the lens of conflict, through geopolitical chess moves and nuclear calculations. But here is what will actually define Iran's future. Not a foreign adversary, not a military strike, but the ground itself. For decades, Iran drained the underground systems that made civilization possible in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Now those systems are collapsing. The damage, confirmed by satellite data, peer-reviewed science, and the words of Iran's own president, may take hundreds of years to reverse. In some places, it may never reverse at all. Wars destroy cities. Cities can be rebuilt, but an aquifer that is permanently collapsed, compressed into ruin over decades of mismanagement and corruption, cannot be rebuilt on any human timescale. That is the threat that no missile can match. That's why the title of this video says what it says. Something much worse than war is already ending Iran as we know it. And it's happening underground right now in 2026. So here's the question that we leave you with today. If a government destroys the natural systems that make a country livable, not through war but through its own choices, does that country survive? And if Iran's water is truly gone, what happens to 90 million people who depend on it? Let us know what you think in the comments, and subscribe to Fall of Nations for more analysis of the forces that are quietly reshaping our world. Something terrifying is spreading across rural China. Entire villages where cancer has become normal. Families losing fathers, mothers, children, sometimes even generations to the same diseases. In some places, people say the water burns their skin. Rivers run strange colors. Fish die by the hundreds. And then the cancer starts. These places now have a name: China's cancer villages. Hundreds of communities scattered across the country where pollution from factories, mines, and chemical plants have turned farmland and drinking water into poison. For years, the government barely acknowledged that they existed. Now the evidence is impossible to hide. The crisis isn't isolated, and it isn't slowing down. It may be one of the darkest consequences of China's rise as the world's manufacturing superpower. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what China built and how fast it built it. In 1978, China was a poor, largely closed country. Then Deng Xiaoping opened the gates. What followed was one of the most breathtaking economic transformations in human history. Within 2 decades, China didn't just industrialize, it became the engine that powered the entire global economy. Deng himself once said, "The Middle East has oil, but China has rare earths." He wasn't wrong. Rare earth metals are the hidden backbone of modern civilization. Neodymium, yttrium, cerium, dysprosium. Now, these are names that most people, including myself, can't pronounce, but metals that are everywhere. They're in your smartphone, your car, your laptop, the wind turbines powering clean energy, the fighter jets defending nations, the MRI machines scanning for illness, the EV batteries everyone is rushing to manufacture. If you own any technology built in the last 30 years, there's a rare earth element inside of it, and there's a very good chance that it came from China. Without these materials, the modern world, as we have built it, does not function. Today, China accounts for roughly 70% of all rare earth mining globally, and a staggering 90% of the world's refining and processing. Figures confirmed by both the U.S. Geological Survey and the International Energy Agency as of 2024. The hub of this empire sits in Baotou, Inner Mongolia, a city of roughly 2.7 million people sitting on top of 80% of China's rare earth reserves, pressed up against the edge of the Gobi Desert. Rare earths were first discovered nearby in the 1930s, but production didn't go ballistic until the 1990s, when China's rapid industrialization kicked into overdrive and the world's appetite for electronics became insatiable. And alongside rare earths came everything else: steel mills, chemical plants, textile factories, battery manufacturers, paper mills, oil refineries, fertilizer facilities, smelters, dye factories, pharmaceutical plants. Industry of every shape and size erupting across the landscape. Between 1990 and 2000, China's rare earth output alone surged by 450%. By 2024, the government's annual production quota hit 270,000 metric tons of rare earth oxide. China became the world's workshop, responsible for roughly 1/3 of all global manufacturing output by 2020. The share of global manufacturing exports grew from just 3% in 1995 to 20% by 2020. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. It was, by almost any economic measure, an astounding achievement. But somewhere inside that story, something else was growing. Something invisible, something that took years to show up, and something absolutely deadly. Here's the part that never makes the trade brochures. All that industry, every factory, refinery, smelter, processing plant, it all creates waste, enormous quantities of it. And for decades, much of that waste had exactly one destination: China's river, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Pearl River. These are not minor waterways. The Yangtze alone supplies around 400 million people with fresh water. These rivers are the lifeblood of civilizations stretching back thousands of years, arteries running through the heart of a country that depended on them for drinking, irrigation, fishing, and survival. And companies were allowed to dump directly into them. We're not talking about trace amounts of mildly questionable chemicals. We're talking about arsenic, lead, cadmium, mercury, chromium, benzene, sulfates, dioxin, uranium, and radioactive byproducts from rare earth processing, all piped or dumped into these rivers in volumes that defy comprehension. A 1997 study of 45 billion cubic meters of Chinese urban wastewater found more than 40 billion cubic meters were completely untreated before discharge. Billions more were added year after year. 40 billion cubic meters, untreated, unfiltered, dumped into the same river that fed hundreds of millions of people. The worst of it collected in so-called tailings ponds, massive holding sites for industrial sludge. The most notorious is the Whitekang Tailings Dam in Baotou, owned by the state-controlled Baogang Group. Now, for many years, this was the single largest dumping site for rare earth waste on the planet. A lake of toxic gray sludge, never properly lined to protect the surrounding soil. That dam sits in the same water table as the Yellow River. The toxins don't stay contained. They migrate, slowly, silently into the ground. A 2014 government survey, the first to be made public at least, found that nearly 60% of China's underground water was contaminated. Studies suggest that more than 70% of rivers and lakes across the country suffer from some degree of pollution. In the North China Plain, home to roughly 400 million people, 70% of groundwater was found to be unfit for human contact. One environmental campaigner, describing the scale of the contamination, said China's river deltas had become its sewer. Nowhere is the horror more visceral than in Dingshu, a small township in Jiangsu province. Safe levels of cadmium, a heavy metal carcinogen, in agricultural soil sit around 2 milligrams per kilogram. Dingshu's riverbed soil measured 1,500 milligrams per kilogram. 1,500, not 15, not 150. 750 times the safe threshold. And that is one chemical in one township in a country of 1.4 billion people. The same story. Different toxins, different rivers, different communities were playing out thousands of times across the nation. What got into the water eventually got into the crops. What got into the crops got into the people. And eventually, people started dying. Badly. By the late 1990s, doctors and local residents across rural China were noticing something that could no longer be quietly dismissed. Villages where everyone seemed to get sick. The same cancers, same organs, the same age groups, one after another, again and again. The phrase cancer village first appeared in Chinese government documents in 1998. The state's own bureaucrats reaching for a term to describe communities where industrial pollution and catastrophic cancer rates existed side by side. But acknowledgement was not action. The phrase went quiet, and people kept dying. In 2009, a Chinese investigative journalist painstakingly mapped more than 100 of these cancer villages. It seemed shocking at the time. It turned out to be nowhere near the full picture. By the mid-2010s, independent estimates climbed past 450. A peer-reviewed study later confirmed that by the end of 2017, at least 462 cancer villages had been documented across 226 countries, reaching into 29 of China's 31 provincial administrative units. Not scattered along a single river, not concentrated in one region, virtually everywhere. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Researchers calculated an average of 7 new cancer villages appearing every single year. Every year without interruption since the crisis began. Cancer is now China's leading cause of death. As of 2022, the most recent comprehensive national data, China recorded an estimated 4.8 million new cancer cases and 2.57 million cancer deaths in a single year. That's more than 7,000 new diagnoses every single day and roughly 7,000 cancer deaths every day. Not over time, but every day. In the hardest hit communities, the numbers are even more brutal. Researchers have documented settlements where up to 30% of all adults are living with cancer. Communities where you don't just know someone who got sick, you're surrounded by them. Where a diagnosis is not a shock, it's simply expected. Grandparents, parents, children, the same disease moving through the same family in the same generation. The cancers mirror the chemistry of the contamination. Liver, stomach, kidneys, lungs, esophagus, blood. Rare earth particles are fine enough to cross the blood-brain barrier, linked to neurological damage in fetuses and young children. Cadmium accelerating in rice irrigated by poisoned water, driving liver and stomach cancers in communities that have farmed the same fields for generations. Chromium contamination tied to blood cancers. Dense clouds of smog driving emphysema and lung disease in communities where the air itself has become a delivery mechanism. One ecologist named Ho Daishan described a village on the Hai River, one of China's most severely polluted waterways, where residents had no real alternative. The water they drank came from a well filled by this river. The fish they ate came from the same river. The vegetables were irrigated by the same water. The river occasionally ran red, sometimes black, with a layer of foul algae sitting on the surface. It would kill fish, it killed livestock. The people had to eat, they had to drink, and so they did, because the alternative was starvation. This is what desperation looks like, choosing between dying now or dying later from the same water source. And most people in these villages can't leave. Cancer treatment in China is expensive relative to rural incomes. Families drain their savings and then go into debt. Some members take jobs in the very factories responsible for the contamination just to pay for chemotherapy. When the money runs out, the patient waits at home, isolated, often unable to work, unable to afford the next round of treatment, watching time pass. One elderly man named Zhang Damin was interviewed by Reuters in 2014. He and his wife both had cancer. He said, quote, "She and I wake up every day just to await death. There is nothing we can do. There is no hope." Later in the same conversation, speaking of his own death, quote, "I just don't want to die too painfully when the end comes." Think about that. I just don't want to die too painfully when the end comes. A man living in the world's second largest economy, whose country assembled the smartphone in your pocket, and he has no hope? But here's the layer underneath all of this, the part where the story stops being a tragedy and starts becoming something more deliberate. Hey, if this is resonating, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We cover the crises that the rest of the media keep looking away from, because what comes next is where this gets truly dark. While people are dying in these villages, Beijing cooked up a strategy, and it wasn't to clean up. For years, data on contaminated soil in China was officially classified, not delayed, not restricted, a formal state secret, meaning researchers, journalists, and citizens who publicized findings on soil contamination would risk prosecution. The government that created the pollution also controlled the record of its consequences. The pattern was consistent and calculated. Local officials who depended on factory revenues for regional GDP numbers had every incentive to suppress reports of illness or contamination. Factories ran two separate waste pipes, one for treated water displayed to inspectors and one for raw effluent used every other day. An activist named Wei Dongying filmed a factory worker describing exactly this practice in 2015. The worker was matter of fact. Inspectors see the clean pipe, and the community gets the dirty one. And when a cancer village can no longer be denied, when deaths are too visible, when journalists had already arrived, the response was not redemption, it's erasure. Nowhere is this better documented than in Baotou, where the state-owned Baogang Group's infamous tailing ponds were officially declared an urban wetland in 2022. A conservation triumph. Officials mentioned migratory birds. When Western journalists traveled to report on this transformation, they found a freshly constructed concrete wall blocking most of the site from view. Peering over it, they found demolition, rusted pipes, collapsed structures, and the ruins of what had been a cancer village. Residents had been relocated from farmland that their families worked for generations to state apartment blocks. The contamination was still in the ground, and the water table had not been treated. The village was gone, but the poison remained. This was also not isolated. Across China, cancer villages have been demolished, populations dispersed, records removed. And when Beijing formally acknowledged that cancer villages existed, for the first time, it was 2013, 15 years after Chinese bureaucrats coined the term, by which point the science had already confirmed 462 of them. Activists who tried to expose the truth found out the price quickly. Wei Dongying spent years investigating more than 60 deaths in her community between 1992 and 2004. She had been arrested dozens of times on fabricated charges, including 10 days in jail for filing a formal complaint against a detergent factory. Followed, monitored, harassed. She said, "The government is obsessed with economic growth, and meanwhile, we ordinary citizens pay the price." The legal architecture made it nearly impossible to assign blame. Dozens of factories contribute dozens of chemicals to a shared water supply. Establishing a direct chain from a specific plant to a specific cancer in a specific person is an extraordinarily difficult task. Industry knows this. The government knows this. The ambiguity is structural, and in many ways, by design. 7 new cancer villages per year, every year. The math does not lie. Now here's something China would prefer that you don't sit with for too long. This crisis was not alone built by China. Every country that relocated its dirty, expensive, tightly regulated manufacturing to China, every corporation that chose cheaper labor and weaker environmental standards over accountability, helped construct the system that poisoned these villages. The trade relationship that the world built over 30 years was, in large part, a transfer of environmental liability. Wealthy nations got cheap goods. China's rural communities absorbed the consequences. The rare earth supply chain is the sharpest illustration. Defense industries, tech giants, and clean energy companies across the world depend on materials processed in places like Baotou. The wind turbines and electric vehicles being sold as the solution to climate change require rare earth magnets produced, right now at the cost of human health in Inner Mongolia. The smartphones and laptops consuming rare earth elements at record rates, powered by an environmental bargain the end user never sees and never agreed to. In April 2025, when Beijing imposed export controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements in retaliation for U.S. tariffs, factories in the U.S. and Europe were forced to cut production. Some temporarily shut down entirely. The IEA confirms China controls not just 70% of rare earth mining, but 91% of global refining and 94% of sintered permanent magnet production. The disruption lasted weeks and sent shockwaves through supply chains from Detroit to Stuttgart. Global markets got a glimpse of what dependency actually looks like. But the world built an addiction to a supply chain grown on poisoned ground. The people living on that ground had no vote in the arrangement. One resident in a contaminated region was asked why these factories were built in the countryside rather than in China's major cities. The answer was blunt: because in Beijing and Shanghai, there are people watching. In the cancer villages, nobody was watching, or more precisely, nobody was allowed to. So where does this leave things now? There are signs of effort. China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment reported that targeted cleanup of a Yellow River tributary in Baotou resulted in ammonia nitrogen levels dropping by 84.6% since 2012. Pollution fines have been uncapped, meaning the worst corporate offenders now face unlimited penalties. Some of the most egregious factories have officially been shut down. NGOs and citizen campaigns have won small but hard-fought victories. But cleanup at this scale is generational work, and the obstacles are enormous. Local officials still have structural incentives to protect industrial revenues over environmental compliance. Data manipulation remains common. Different government agencies regularly publish contradictory figures on pollution levels, making it nearly impossible to track real progress. Factories that close often quietly reopen under new names or shift operations to a different province. The groundwater contamination accumulated over 30 years will not be reversed in 5 or 10 or perhaps 20. And the cancer villages, they're not a relic of the past. They're still forming, 7 per year on average. Today, residents in contaminated zones are drilling deeper wells to try to escape the worst surface contamination. But the poisons have migrated downward too, following the water table, chasing people through the soil. The crisis doesn't stop. It just moves deeper. And Beijing, despite the cleanup announcements, still have not released a comprehensive national map of where the worst contamination sits. That information remains, to this day, largely absent from public records. The full count of cancer villages may never be known. Beijing doesn't publish one. Journalists are still blocked from many affected areas. Citizens who speak out still face arrest. And the underlying logic that created this, growth above all, GDP above human health, has not fundamentally changed. China's economic miracle is real. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and built the infrastructure that the modern world runs on. And to be fair, parts of the Chinese government understand the scale of what's being built and the scale of what has to be cleaned up. But in the cancer villages, the cost of that miracle is measured differently. It's measured in savings wiped out by chemotherapy that arrives too late, in children diagnosed with cancers that have no business existing in childhood, in families reduced to waiting, in an elderly man who wakes up each morning just to await death in a country whose prosperity he helped build with his labor and his land and his silence. The cancer villages are not an accident of industrialization. They're the receipt, a hidden bill that comes due when a society decides that growth matters more than the people growing it. Something terrifying is spreading across rural China, not as a metaphor, not a distant abstraction, not as a story from the past that has since been resolved. Right now, as you watch this, the same pattern is repeating somewhere new. Factory upstream, river downstream, families in between. So here is what we'll leave you with today. At what point does cheap technology become too expensive? And if the world helped build this system, does the world share responsibility for dismantling it? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to Fall of Nations, because these are the stories that matter most when nobody else is watching.
China is facing the most ironic crisis of the 21st century. It's drowning in floods while dying of thirst. Megacities submerged under record-breaking rain. Farmers praying as rivers vanish. And the country that tried to conquer nature with dams, canals, and steel is now being destroyed by that very element it thought it had mastered. They built an empire to control water, but this time, water's in control. China has more dams than any other country on Earth. It commands rivers, diverts entire provinces, and builds at a scale no other nation can match. And yet, entire regions flood every summer, while others scrape the last drops from collapsing aquifers. That's the terrifying paradox at the heart of this story. And it's not a warning about the future, it's already happening. let's break down how China, one of the most powerful nations in the world, is slowly being undone by its greatest weakness. And it started with water taking back what was stolen. 2024 brought 26 major floods, 84 million victims, and billions in losses. The worst in a generation. Between June 18th and July 1st, Guangdong Province was pummeled with 759.6 millimeters of rainfall, the most intense deluge the region had seen in over 60 years. Rivers rose almost 10 meters overnight. Towns vanished. The ground itself gave way. And then came the Meizhou Highway collapse. On May 1st, waterlogged soil dissolved beneath a section of the Meilong Expressway. The road crumbled. 48 people died. Vehicles tumbled into the abyss as the earth gave way beneath them. This wasn't just rain. This was structural collapse triggered by water saturation. Meanwhile, the Yangtze River was raging beyond control. Water levels surged past warning thresholds. The ministry activated emergency protocols. The entire cities along the river went into lockdown mode. Sirens blared through the night. Emergency broadcasts warned residents to evacuate immediately. But many didn't make it out in time. Over 3.3 million people fled their homes, some carrying whatever they could grab in minutes. Others leaving with nothing but the clothes on their backs. 50,000 houses were destroyed, another 630,000 damaged. Families returned to find their homes buried in mud, walls collapsed, possessions floating in toxic floodwater. When the floods couldn't be contained, authorities made brutal choices we'll come back to later. But you'd think China would have a solution for this, right? After all, this is the nation that built the Three Gorges Dam, the largest hydroelectric dam on the planet. A 2.3-kilometer-wide colossus designed specifically to tame the Yangtze River and prevent catastrophic flooding. Except, it didn't work. During the 2024 floods, the Three Gorges Dam was forced to open its floodgates repeatedly, releasing massive torrents of water downstream. Officials had no choice. The reservoir was filling too fast. If they didn't discharge water, the dam itself could face structural failure. So they released the flood, and downstream communities paid the price. The dam was supposed to reduce major flooding from once every 10 years to once every century. Instead, less than 25 years after its completion, China is experiencing some of its worst floods in modern history. The government has even admitted publicly that the dam cannot control floods for the entire Yangtze Basin. So what went wrong? The problem isn't just nature. It's human arrogance. China has over 98,000 dams. Most were built in the 1950s and 60s, and they're now aging, crumbling, and poorly maintained. Between 1954 and 2005 alone, 3,486 reservoirs collapsed. In 1975, the Banqiao Dam failed, killing tens of thousands. Some estimates go as high as 200,000 deaths. And it's not just the dams, it's everything. China paved over its wetlands. It drained its natural floodplains. It built megacities on river deltas where water has nowhere to go. Entire urban centers have poor or non-existent drainage systems. So when the rains come, the water just sits there, pooling, rising, drowning. In July 2021, Zhengzhou experienced what meteorologists called a once-in-a-thousand-years rainstorm. Over 3 days, 617 millimeters of rain fell. Almost a year's worth, with 201.9 millimeters coming down in just 1 hour. The city's subway system flooded within minutes. Over 500 passengers were trapped inside Line 5 trains as water poured through ventilation shafts and breached retaining walls at a nearby rail yard. The water rose fast, ankle deep, then waist high, then chest deep. Passengers posted desperate videos on social media. In the footage, you can see people packed into subway cars, water up to their necks, struggling to breathe as oxygen ran out. Some screamed for help. Others stood in eerie silence, holding their phones above the waterline, documenting what they thought might be their final moments. Rescuers couldn't reach them for over 4 hours. The streets above were rivers. Emergency vehicles were stranded. By the time they cut through the roof of the train to pull survivors out, 14 people had drowned. And a subway built to showcase China's technological prowess, in tunnels designed to withstand a 200-year storm. But this was a once-in-a-thousand-year storm. and the infrastructure wasn't ready. China tried to conquer water with concrete and steel, but water doesn't care about engineering. It finds every weakness, every crack, every miscalculation. And in 2024, it found them all. Now, here's the irony that should make your jaw drop. China actually had a solution. A revolutionary urban planning concept called sponge cities, launched back in 2015 specifically to prevent these disasters. The idea was brilliant on paper. Instead of channeling water away from pipes and concrete, these cities would absorb it like a sponge. Green roofs, permeable pavements, wetland parks, rain gardens, nature-based infrastructure designed to soak up rainfall and release it slowly. By 2030, China planned to have 80% of its urban areas meeting sponge city standards. Over 130 cities drew up transformation plans. The government invested billions. International experts praised the vision. Meichao in Guangdong Province designated a sponge city. And in June 2024, Meichao experienced some of the summer's worst flooding. One town recorded 367 millimeters of rain in a single day. And the sponge infrastructure completely collapsed under the deluge. Turns out, sponge cities can handle moderate rainfall, maybe even heavy storms. But when you get hit with once-in-a-century downpours, the kind that climate change is making routine, the green infrastructure simply can't cope. Experts now admit that sponge city designs struggle with anything over 200 millimeters of rainfall per day. Beyond that threshold, you still need the old-fashioned hard engineering, dams, embankments, massive drainage systems. So, China built eco-cities that were supposed to work with nature, and nature overwhelmed them anyway. The sponge cities didn't fail because the concept was bad. They failed because climate change is making rainfall extremes more violent than anyone predicted when these systems were designed. China tried to adapt, but the crisis is evolving faster than the solutions. And when southern China was drowning under record rainfall, another catastrophe was already unfolding in the north, one that could end civilization itself. China wasn't just fighting too much water, it was running out of it. In northern China, rivers had turned to dust. This isn't a temporary dry spell. This is existential water scarcity, the kind that ends civilizations. Here's the paradox. Northern China holds 43% of the country's population and over 65% of its farmland. But it only has access to 14% of China's water supply. Let that sink in. Nearly half the nation lives in a region that has almost no water. In 2022, the Yangtze River, which provides drinking water to over 400 million people, experienced its worst drought on record since 1865. Entire stretches of the river dried up completely. Riverbeds that had flowed for millennia turned to cracked mud. Boats sat stranded on exposed rocks. Farmers stared at empty irrigation channels, watching their crops wither. By August 2022, rainfall in the Yangtze Basin was 60% below normal. The river fell to historically low levels, and the impacts cascaded across every sector of society. Sichuan Province, which relies on hydropower for 80% of its electricity, went dark. Reservoirs that once fed massive turbines dropped to half their normal levels. Power generation collapsed. Factories shut down. Whole cities dimmed to save power. For millions, night fell early. Major companies, Toyota, Foxconn, Tesla, suspended operations. Even streetlights were cut. Over 2.46 million people were affected. Around 780,000 had to rely on emergency government water deliveries. Trucks rolled into villages carrying tanks of water, the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. Farmers watched helplessly as rice paddies turned brown. Corn stalks withered in fields that had produced harvests for generations. Elderly villagers who had lived through famines spoke of the fear returning, the uncertainty of not knowing where the next drink would come from. In cities, residents were told to limit showers to 3 minutes. Fountains went dry. Public parks turned to dust. And this wasn't an isolated event. It lasted for months. By late August, the Chinese government warned that the drought could extend well into September. threatening the autumn harvest. The economic toll reached billions of yuan. Agricultural output plummeted. Wildfires broke out across bone-dry hillsides in Chongqing. But the real nightmare is happening underground. Northern China has been overpumping its aquifers for decades. In Hebei province, which surrounds Beijing, the deep aquifer drops by about 3 meters every single year. Wells that used to hit water at 50 meters now have to drill to 200 meters or deeper. Many have simply run dry. The Yellow River, which once nourished entire dynasties, barely reaches the sea anymore. Between 1985 and 2000, it literally ran dry every year for part of the season, drained by agriculture and industry before it could complete its natural flow. Hebei province has lost 969 out of its 1,052 lakes. Let that number haunt you. Nearly every lake gone. The land itself is collapsing. Over-extraction of groundwater has caused massive subsidence in northern cities. The ground is literally sinking as the water beneath it disappears. And climate change is making it worse. A 2025 study found that Tibet's spring temperatures are the warmest they've been in over 40 years. That warmth disrupts monsoon patterns, creating wild extremes, devastating floods in the south, crippling droughts in the north. Water scarcity now costs China an estimated $35 billion per year in direct economic losses. That's more than twice the cost of flooding. So Beijing did what it always does when nature disobeys. It built something bigger. Enter the most ambitious water project ever attempted, a plan to move rivers. The South to North Water Diversion Project was supposed to fix everything. This isn't just a pipeline, it's a monumental network of canals, tunnels, and pumping stations designed to transfer water from the water-rich Yangtze River Basin in the south to the parched cities and farmlands of the north. The scale is almost incomprehensible. $60 billion, 200,000 displaced. Canals so vast they're visible from space. It aims to move 21 billion cubic meters of water annually by 2030, and potentially double that in the future. On paper, it's a miracle. In practice, it's a band-aid on a hemorrhaging wound. The problem is simple. Even with this massive diversion, it's still not enough. Water demand in the north continues to outpace supply. Beijing is already planning additional diversions, this time directly from the Three Gorges Dam reservoir just to keep up. And the costs keep mounting. Water is lost during transit through aging infrastructure. Canals leak. Evaporation takes its toll. Environmental damage in the donor regions is severe. Southern ecosystems that depend on consistent water flow are now under stress. Meanwhile, the fundamental issue remains unaddressed. China is using water faster than nature can replenish it. A 2024 study warned that water stress in China is projected to be most severe between 2025 and 2035. We're in that window right now. Northern river basins will continue to experience acute water scarcity. And even with all the engineering, all the mega projects, all the forced relocations, it may not be enough. Why? Because even rivers can't escape gravity. And while the north ran dry, the south began to drown in poison. The floods and droughts were just symptoms. The real killer is invisible. More than 70% of China's rivers are contaminated. Decades of breakneck industrialization, lax environmental enforcement, and agricultural runoff have turned vast stretches of China's water supply into toxic sludge. In 2024, China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment reported that 90.4% of surface water met good quality standards, the first time the country passed the 90% threshold. Officials boast of progress, but the other 10%? Toxic enough to kill a city. In a country of 1.4 billion people, 10% is a catastrophe. More than 60% of China's groundwater, the water beneath cities and farmland, is classified as unfit for human consumption. Not just undrinkable, unsafe even for irrigation or industrial use. Approximately 700 million people in China consume water contaminated with dangerous levels of pollutants. That's half the population drinking slow death every day. The sources of contamination are everywhere. Industrial wastewater dumped directly into rivers, sometimes in the dead of night to avoid inspectors. Untreated sewage flowing into lakes from cities that grew faster than their treatment infrastructure. Agricultural fertilizers and pesticides washing into groundwater with every rain. Heavy metals like lead, mercury, and cadmium leaching into drinking supplies from abandoned mines and factories. In some factories, workers have reported seeing discharge pipes that only operate at night, emptying chemical waste directly into nearby streams. Local officials turn a blind eye. Economic growth trumps environmental enforcement. One chemical plant, one village downstream dying of cancer. There are villages in rural China where the water runs black, others where it smells like gasoline. In some regions near factories, the rivers turn red or bright green depending on what dyes the textile plants are using that week. In one county in Anhui Province, locals call a particular stretch of river Cancer Creek because 7 out of 10 families along its banks have lost someone to cancer. Children are born with deformities. Tumors cluster in villages downstream from chemical plants. Life expectancy in these areas can be 10 to 15 years shorter than the national average. In 2013, thousands of dead pigs were found floating down the Huangpu River near Shanghai. In 2005, a benzene spill from a petrochemical plant explosion sent 100 tons of toxic chemicals into the Songhua River, forcing the city of Harbin, home to 9 million people, to shut off the water supply for days. These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a systematic collapse. Water pollution causes over 100,000 deaths annually in China, from cancer, organ failure, and waterborne diseases. And that's likely an undercount, because local officials have incentives to hide the true numbers. In 2007, Lake Tai, one of China's largest freshwater lakes, experienced a catastrophic algae bloom triggered by decades of industrial pollution. The bloom killed off aquatic life and made the water completely unusable. Over 5.8 million people lost access to their primary water source overnight. The lake remains largely unsafe for drinking today, despite billions spent on the cleanup efforts. The Chinese government knows this is existential. In the first half of 2017 alone, China spent an estimated $100 billion on water cleanup projects. New wastewater treatment plants, stricter regulations, crackdowns on polluting factories. But enforcement remains spotty. Local officials often prioritize economic growth over environmental protection, and corruption means polluters can bribe their way out of consequences. Between 2001 and 2006, wastewater discharges increased continuously despite national mandates to reduce pollution. One water pollution incident occurs roughly every 2 to 3 days on average. And when water runs out or turns toxic, Beijing does what it always does. It picks who survives. The cities get the water, the villages get the flood. In 2020, when floodwaters threatened major urban centers in Anhui Province, authorities made a decision. They blew up levees and dams in rural areas to redirect the water away from the cities. Entire villages were submerged. Farmland was destroyed. Tens of thousands of people lost everything. One farmer described being woken up at 2 a.m. by explosions. By the time he ran outside, the water was already rising. His fields, his family's livelihood, were gone. And this, he said, happened every year. In China's calculus, a drowned village is cheaper than a flooded city. But it's not just about floods. Beijing once diverted an entire river, the Zhuma River, to supply water to a petrochemical plant. Downstream, 120,000 villagers were left staring at a dry riverbed. Their irrigation source, used for generations, simply vanished overnight. The plant got its water, the villagers got nothing. This is the brutal calculus of water scarcity under authoritarian rule. When resources are limited, the state picks winners and losers. Cities win, industry wins, farmers and rural communities lose. and it's driving internal tensions. Millions of people are fleeing water-scarce regions, migrating towards cities that already struggle to provide adequate water. Environmental refugees are a growing reality in China. People displaced not by war, but by collapsing ecosystems. The inequality is staggering. Wealthy urban residents can afford bottled water and advanced filtration systems. Rural families are drinking from wells contaminated with industrial waste and agricultural runoff. The same wells that have been linked to skyrocketing cancer rates in so-called cancer villages. This isn't just an environmental crisis, it's a social and political powder keg. And yet, every sacrifice buys less time. Because what's collapsing isn't just infrastructure, it's the system itself. When the water fails, everything fails. China feeds 1.4 billion people, but the land feeding them is dying of thirst. Rice output in northern regions could drop by 13% by 2030. Wheat and corn yields are declining. Farmers are abandoning land that can no longer be irrigated. If China can't feed itself, it will be forced to import on a massive scale. And when the world's most populous nation starts panic buying food on global markets, prices will explode. The ripple effects would trigger food insecurity across the developing world, potentially sparking unrest, migration crises, and political fracture in vulnerable regions. Then there's energy. China is the world's largest energy consumer, and nearly 90% of its electricity generation requires significant water. Hydropower, coal plants, nuclear reactors all depend on it. When droughts hit, power grids fail, factories shut down, supply chains break. And here's where it gets global. China produces the majority of the world's aluminum, magnesium, rare earth metals, and polysilicon for solar panels. When water shortages force power cuts, production of these critical materials halts. When Shanxi lost power in 2021, Europe's car factories stalled. That was a preview. Now, imagine that happening not for a few weeks, but for years, across multiple industries simultaneously. That's the nightmare scenario China is facing. And it's not just about manufacturing. The global transition to clean energy depends on Chinese production. Wind turbines need rare earth metals. Solar panels need polysilicon. Electric vehicle batteries need lithium processing. All of these industries require massive amounts of water. If China's water crisis worsens, the entire world's climate goals could be derailed. Think about that. The planet's push to combat climate change could be crippled by a water crisis in the country producing most of the green energy. Then there's the political dimension. The Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy rests on delivering economic growth and rising living standards. The social contract is simple. Citizens accept authoritarian rule in exchange for prosperity and stability. But when millions of people can't access clean drinking water, when crops fail, when blackouts become routine, when entire regions are abandoned due to environmental collapse, that contract breaks down. Water scarcity is the kind of crisis that topples governments. Throughout history, civilizations that mismanaged water didn't just decline, they vanished. The Mayans, the Mesopotamians, the ancestral Puebloans. When the water ran out, the empires fell. And China knows this. For decades, the world feared China's rise. But water may bring about its fall. China set out to conquer nature. Instead, nature is conquering China. It built more dams than any nation in history. It moved entire rivers. It poured concrete over floodplains and drilled into aquifers that had taken millennia to form. And for a while, it worked. China's economy exploded. Cities rose from nothing. Farmland produced record yields. The world marveled at the speed and scale of it all. But nature doesn't forget, and water doesn't forgive. Now, the nation that wanted to lead the world is drowning in the south, drying up in the north, and choking on poison in between. The paradox is complete. China has water everywhere, and not enough to drink. The floods can't be stopped. The droughts can't be reversed. The pollution runs deep. And the mega projects, the dams, the canals, the desperate attempts to engineer a solution, are failing. Because you can't dominate nature. You can only work with it. And when you ignore that truth for too long, nature strikes back. History's oldest lesson still holds true. No empire survives when the water runs out. So, what do you think? Is China's water crisis a warning for the rest of the world? Or is this a problem only Beijing can solve? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to see more deep dives into the forces shaping our world, hit that subscribe button, because this story, it's just the beginning.
The water is vanishing. Right now, across China, rivers are running dry, lakes are turning to dust, and the taps of the world's most populous nation are about to run empty. But China has a solution, a terrifying solution. They're going to steal water from everyone else. With control of Tibet's vast water resources, Asia's water tower that feeds over 1.4 billion people across the continent, Beijing has engineered the world's most extensive dam network, 87,000 structures that dominate Asia's river systems. And now they're turning off the taps. Countries downstream are already feeling the devastation. Farmlands withering, fisheries collapsing, entire communities facing extinction. This isn't just an environmental disaster, it's a calculated act of hydrological warfare, and the world isn't ready for what comes next. What's happening now isn't chaos, it's strategy. Since China annexed Tibet in 1951, they didn't just gain territory. They seized control of the source waters for most of Asia's great rivers. For decades, they've been patient, building, planning, creating the infrastructure for absolute control. While the world obsesses over military buildups, missile tests, and trade wars, China has been quietly waging a different kind of battle, one for the most precious resource of all. And now, the crisis is accelerating. The headlines will tell you China is facing water scarcity, but that barely scratches the surface. Despite having 20% of the world's population, China possesses only 7% of global freshwater resources. But it gets worse. The water China does have is in the wrong place. Northern China, home to 40% of the population and 45% of its agriculture, has just 4% of the country's water. Meanwhile, the south has 80% of the water, but not enough farmland to use it. Beijing, the capital city of 21 million people, now has water availability comparable to countries in the Middle East. Each resident has access to just 120 cubic meters per year, an amount that qualifies as extreme water scarcity under UNICEF standards. The numbers are stark. According to recent reports from the Chinese Ministry of Water Resources, per capita water availability has dropped to approximately 2,000 cubic meters, just one-third of the global average of 6,200, and rapidly approaching the international water scarcity threshold of 1,700 cubic meters. Former Premier Wen Jiabao wasn't exaggerating when he warned that water shortages threaten the very survival of the Chinese nation. This isn't hyperbole, it's hydropolitics. Think that's bad? Wait until you hear what's happening underground. Over 80% of China's groundwater is now contaminated to the point where it can't be safely used, not for drinking, not for agriculture, not even for industry. In some northern industrial cities, the groundwater has become so toxic that it can literally catch fire. And the situation is only getting worse. Climate change is accelerating the meltdown of Tibetan glaciers, the source of most of China's major rivers. According to Greenpeace, these ice reserves could reach peak water, the point where meltwater supply begins to permanently decline as early as 2030. What's happening in China now is the world's largest water redistribution effort. Groundwater depletion across the north has become so severe that China was forced to divert water from the south. In Beijing, water levels became so critical that the government launched the massive South-North Water Transfer Project, an infrastructure system of canals, tunnels, and pumping stations designed to move water from the Yangtze River Basin to the parched cities of the North China Plain, home to over 400 million people. According to a 2023 study by the National Climate Center, about 28,000 rivers, over half of China's once mapped waterways, have disappeared entirely since the 1990s. This isn't gradual change, it's hydrological collapse. For China's leadership, this isn't just an environmental challenge, it's an existential threat to the regime itself. No water means no food. No food means instability, and instability is the Chinese Communist Party's greatest fear. But here's where things go off the rails. China's solution to its water crisis isn't conservation or pollution control. It's control. Total, absolute control of Asia's rivers. Over the past 3 decades, China has assembled the world's largest hydrological control system. The scale is almost incomprehensible, but it's not just the number that matters, it's the location. By strategically placing dams near international borders, China has positioned itself to control the headwaters of 10 major river systems that flow into 18 downstream countries. The Mekong, which 60 million people depend on in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. The Brahmaputra, which sustains nearly 200 million people in India and Bangladesh. The Indus and its tributaries, which are the lifeblood of Pakistan. When you control water flow to these countries, you don't just have influence, you have domination. This dam empire isn't the product of coincidence. It's a deliberate strategy, decades in the making. You think that's concerning? What you're about to find out next will completely blow your mind. These aren't just ordinary dams, they're weaponized infrastructure. And the crown jewel, the Three Gorges Dam, the world's largest hydroelectric power station. This mammoth structure spans the Yangtze River with a wall that generates around 100 terawatt-hours of electricity annually, enough to power entire nations. But the Three Gorges Dam isn't just about power generation. It's a symbol of China's massive hydraulic engineering ambitions. The dam's construction displaced 1.3 million people and submerged 13 cities, 140 towns, and 1,350 villages. Archaeological sites, cultural relics, and ecosystems were lost forever beneath the rising waters. Some Western engineers initially believed the project was technically impossible. Even many Chinese experts raised alarms about environmental impacts, sedimentation issues, and geological risks. Beijing pushed ahead anyway, because the Three Gorges Dam isn't just infrastructure, it's a demonstration of the Communist Party's power to bend nature itself to its will. And it's just the beginning. Modern dam systems come equipped with advanced sensors, automated controls, and precision management capabilities. They don't just generate electricity, they gather data, control flow rates with surgical precision, and can be operated remotely. This gives China unprecedented control. They can release water suddenly, causing flash floods that devastate communities downstream, hold back water during critical planting seasons, destroying harvest across entire regions, time water releases to maximize their own hydroelectric output, regardless of the impact on others. And here's the kicker: China has consistently rejected any legally binding water sharing agreements with downstream countries. In 1997, they were one of only 3 countries to vote against the UN Watercourses Convention, the international framework for managing shared rivers. The message is clear: China will do what it wants with its water. But if this is just about dams and water management, why call it warfare? Because water isn't just another resource, it's life itself. Throughout history, controlling water has meant controlling people. Ancient Mesopotamian rulers diverted rivers to starve enemies into submission. Military strategists have targeted war infrastructure to force capitulation. What China is doing now, though, is different. It's not tactical, it's strategic. They're not just using water as a weapon during conflict. They're using it as a form of silent coercion every day without firing a shot. In 2019, something extraordinary happened on the Mekong River that revealed China's water strategy in action. While Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam suffered their worst drought in a century, satellite data from Eyes on Earth revealed a shocking truth. China's portion of the river basin received normal to above average rainfall. Their dams were full, yet downstream, the river was at record lows. For 6 months, China's dams completely blocked the annual monsoon rise in river level, something that hadn't happened since modern records began. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The results were catastrophic across Southeast Asia. Cambodia's Tonle Sap Lake, which normally provides 500,000 tons of fish annually, failed to flood, devastating fish stocks. Thailand's sugar production dropped by approximately 20 to 30%. Vietnamese rice fields were destroyed by saltwater intrusion as the river ran too low to keep the ocean at bay, all while China had plenty of water. When confronted with evidence, Beijing released a small amount of water, but only after the damage was done and only enough to appear cooperative. This wasn't a natural disaster, it was a demonstration of power. The evidence is damning. During the peak of the downstream drought in 2019, analysis by the Stimson Center found that China's section of the Mekong received normal to above average rainfall. Yet Chinese dam operators restricted the river's flow by nearly 50%, causing water levels downstream to plunge to record lows, even as satellite imagery showed upstream reservoirs near full capacity. Brian Eiler, director of the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia program, put it bluntly: China largely ignored the needs of downstream communities when operating its upstream dams on the Mekong. If you're finding this deep dive into water geopolitics valuable, consider hitting subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing these important global stories to light. Thanks for being part of our community. Now let's get back to China's water strategy. The Mekong example reveals another disturbing aspect of China's strategy: data manipulation as a weapon. For years, China refused to share basic hydrological data with downstream Mekong countries. Then, in 2016, they established their own Lancang-Mekong Cooperation Framework, positioned as a gesture of goodwill. But independent scientists quickly spotted the deception. The data China shares is selective, often incomplete, and provided too late to be actionable for downstream nations. When the Stimson Center and Eyes on Earth published evidence of China's water manipulation using satellite data, Beijing didn't deny the facts. Instead, they launched a coordinated propaganda campaign, attacking the researchers' methodology while offering no substantive counter-evidence. The pattern is clear: control the water, control the narrative, control the region. China is now exporting this playbook around the world. In Kenya, Ethiopia, and other African nations, Chinese-built dams come with the same opaque management practices and asymmetrical power relationships, and it's not an isolated incident. In January 2021, China once again restricted water flow from the Jinghong Dam for grid maintenance, but only notified downstream countries 6 days after they started holding back water. If China is willing to use water as leverage during peacetime, what would they do during a crisis? The Mekong's devastation reveals a harsh truth about modern hydropower. These aren't green energy products as advertised. They're instruments of control. A single large hydroelectric dam generates clean electricity, yes, but a cascade of megadams transforms an entire river system from a natural resource into a managed machine, with one finger on the switch. The ecological destruction is just collateral damage in a larger strategic game. What makes this situation particularly insidious is the way China uses environmental rhetoric to justify its dam building. Beijing regularly touts hydropower as a climate solution and key to its carbon neutrality goals. When downstream countries raise concerns about water flow, Chinese officials speak of optimization and efficiency, technocratic language that masks raw power politics. Even the economic arguments are misleading. Research shows that many massive hydropower projects generate far less electricity than promised, while costing substantially more than projected. The Lower Sasan II Dam in Cambodia, for instance, will produce only 1/3 the power originally claimed, according to independent engineers. Yet the full environmental and social costs remain. While the Mekong crisis plays out, an even more dangerous situation is developing on the China-India border. China is now building what could become the world's largest hydroelectric project on the Brahmaputra River, an engineering marvel that would dwarf even the Three Gorges Dam's output. The location? Just 30 kilometers from India's border, in a disputed territory. This isn't just about electricity, it's about control over one of India's most crucial rivers. Even more frightening is the potential for water bombs, the sudden release of massive amounts of water that could cause catastrophic flooding downstream with virtually no warning time. During a previous border standoff in 2017, China stopped sharing hydrological data with India, critical information that helps prepare for floods and manage water resources. The result? Deadly floods swept through Assam, killing nearly 300 people and displacing millions. India, recognizing the existential threat, isn't sitting idle. They're planning their own massive dam in Arunachal Pradesh, the Upper Siang multi-purpose project, creating a dangerous dam for dam escalation. Caught in the middle is Bangladesh, one of the world's most water-vulnerable nations, which will suffer no matter who wins this hydro war. What we're seeing is nothing less than the militarization of water, but it gets even worse. China's water empire doesn't stop at its borders. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China has financed and built dozens of dams across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, extending its hydrological influence worldwide. The pattern is clear. China offers attractive loans to developing countries for dam construction. Chinese companies build and often operate the dams. The host country becomes indebted to China, and China gains control over critical water infrastructure far beyond its borders. Take Laos, now dubbed the Battery of Southeast Asia. The country has fallen deep into debt with China, owing about $6.9 billion, half its entire external public debt. Of the 45 major dams on the Mekong system, 21 are in Laos, but on paper only. Most are built, financed, and controlled by Chinese companies. For example, the Namu River Cascade, 7 dams in northern Laos, is 85% owned by China's Power China, which will operate them for 29 years. This isn't just infrastructure development, it's hydrological colonization. The human cost of this water-based expansion is staggering and often hidden from view. In Cambodia, the Chinese-backed Lower Sason 2 dam has devastated local communities. Over 5,000 people, mostly indigenous families who had lived along the river for generations, were forced from their ancestral homes. One Laotian farmer, displaced by the Namu Cascade, put it bluntly, "We used to catch fish from the river and grow rice on its banks. Now we have nothing. And for what? So they can send electricity to China." And if you think this is just a problem for Asia, think again. The implications of China's water hegemony extend far beyond the continent. When rivers run dry, crops fail. When crops fail, food prices surge globally. And when food prices surge, political instability follows. China is already the world's largest importer of soybeans and a major buyer of grain. If their water crisis worsens and their agricultural output collapses, global food markets will feel the shock. The water wars now unfolding could trigger waves of migration that dwarf anything we've seen in recent decades. Tens of millions of people forced to move as their water sources disappear or become contaminated. More immediately threatening is the potential for actual conflict. Water disputes between nuclear powers like China, India, and Pakistan add a dangerous new dimension to already tense relationships. If India feels its water security is threatened beyond a certain point, it may feel compelled to take military action. Pakistan, which depends on rivers flowing from India, faces similar pressures. And unlike oil, water has no substitutes. You can switch from oil to solar. You can't switch from water to anything else. This makes water the ultimate leverage point in 21st century geopolitics. The environmental consequences of China's dam-building frenzy extend far beyond water quantity issues. The entire ecological balance of Asia's great rivers is under threat. Consider sediment, the nutrient-rich soil particles carried by rivers from mountains to deltas and floodplains. Studies show China's dams have already reduced sediment loads on the Mekong by over 50%. This isn't just an abstract scientific concern. Sediment deposits are what make river deltas and floodplains fertile. Without them, agricultural productivity collapses. Vietnam's Mekong Delta, the country's rice bowl, is already showing signs of distress. Reduced sediment has accelerated coastal erosion, allowing salt water to infiltrate further inland. Some coastal areas are eroding at a rate of 30 meters per year. The dams also interrupt fish migration patterns. Species that evolved to swim upstream to spawn now find their journeys blocked by concrete walls. The Mekong, home to over 1,000 fish species, has already seen catastrophic declines in fish populations. One study by the Mekong River Commission estimates that by 2040, fish stocks in the lower Mekong Basin could decline by up to 40%, threatening the primary protein source for millions of people. Even the natural rhythm of rivers, the seasonal rising and falling that ecosystems depend on, has been disrupted. Plants and animals that evolved over millennia to sync their life cycles with these natural pulses now face an artificially managed flow. The combined effect is nothing less than ecocide on a continental scale. So what can be done to prevent this slow-motion catastrophe? The international community has limited options. Diplomatic pressure? China has shown it's willing to ignore international opinion when its core interests are at stake. Economic sanctions? Few countries are willing to jeopardize trade relationships with the world's second-largest economy over water issues. Military deterrence? Attacking dams is considered a war crime under international law and could trigger devastating retaliation. The most promising approach may be scientific monitoring and transparency. Satellite systems, like those used to expose China's Mekong water manipulation, make it harder to hide hydrological warfare. But the scientific community faces its own challenges in this water Cold War. Chinese academics who publish research questioning official water policy risk their careers, or worse. International scientific cooperation on transboundary rivers has become increasingly difficult as geopolitical tensions rise. Even basic hydrological data that was once freely shared is now treated as sensitive information with national security implications. China classifies detailed information about its dams and water management practices as state secrets. This information blackout extends to public health concerns as well. The pollution choking China's rivers doesn't stop at international borders. Contaminants from Chinese factories, mines, and farms flow downstream into neighboring countries. Testing by independent researchers has found elevated levels of heavy metals, antibiotics, and industrial chemicals in rivers leaving China. But without comprehensive monitoring programs and data sharing, downstream countries struggle to identify the sources of pollution or hold anyone accountable. One example, a 2024 study published in Science of the Total Environment found levels of arsenic, cadmium, and mercury in Vietnam's section of the Red River at concentrations up to 500% higher than World Health Organization safety standards. The source? Industrial waste from Chinese factories upstream. Medical researchers have documented rising rates of birth defects, cancer, and gastrointestinal diseases in communities that rely on these contaminated rivers. These health impacts represent the hidden human cost of China's water policies. Meanwhile, China continues to position itself as an environmental leader on the global stage while simultaneously building more dams at home and financing them abroad. This fundamental disconnect between rhetoric and reality makes addressing the crisis even more challenging. But the fundamental problem remains. As China's internal water crisis deepens, its control over foreign water sources will only grow more aggressive. The infrastructure is built, the strategy is in motion, and most of the world still hasn't woken up to the threat. Every day without action locks in this dangerous new reality. And with each new dam, the leverage shifts further in China's favor. For downstream countries, the options are bleak. They can submit to China's growing influence and accept whatever water Beijing chooses to release. They can build their own massive water infrastructure in a desperate attempt to counter Chinese control, or they can prepare for a future of increasing water scarcity and the social upheaval that follows. None of these options look promising. A worrying example of China's growing leverage. In 2020, Cambodia and Laos both walked back their criticism of Chinese dam operations after Beijing offered COVID-19 vaccine shipments and economic packages. Thailand similarly muted its concerns after China threatened to restrict outbound tourism, one of its key economic lifelines. Water has become China's most effective diplomatic weapon in Southeast Asia, more potent than economic pressure or military posturing. When a country controls your water, you think twice before challenging them on anything. The reality remains. When it comes to water, China takes what it wants. So what's next on the horizon? China's 14th five-year plan, 2021 to 2025, prioritizes hydropower development on the Brahmaputra River, raising fresh concerns in India as construction edges closer to the border. Some engineers have even floated proposals to divert water north, an idea with potentially catastrophic consequences for downstream nations. The North-South Water Transfer Project, China's approximately $62 billion attempt to redirect southern water to northern cities, has already moved over 60 billion cubic meters of water through 3 massive artificial canals. Now, planners are looking to extend this mega project to capture Tibetan river waters. Multiple water experts, including those who have studied China's water policies, have raised concerns about the international implications. The consensus among specialists is that China consistently prioritizes domestic water security over cooperative water management with downstream nations. And with climate change accelerating water scarcity across Asia, the pressure on all parties will only increase. The most alarming prospect isn't theoretical, it's already taking shape. Historical evidence shows how water conflicts escalate. When China restricted water flow during India's 2017 border standoff, it resulted in deadly floods. When they held back Mekong waters in 2019, it devastated agriculture across 4 countries. These weren't accidents, they were demonstrations of power. Now consider the stakes. China faces worsening droughts in its agricultural regions. A 2023 study in the journal Earth's Future projected that agricultural water scarcity in northern China could increase by up to 50% by 2030. When faced with domestic water shortages in the past, China's response has been consistent: prioritize internal needs at all costs. For India, water security is equally non-negotiable. After China announced its Brahmaputra Dam plans, Indian officials expressed serious concerns, with some characterizing potential water diversion as a threat to national security. Both nuclear powers view water as a matter of national security. Both are building massive dam infrastructure. Both face increasing climate pressures. The flashpoints are multiplying. The margin for error is shrinking. Beyond all geopolitical calculations lies an uncomfortable truth. The world's water crisis is accelerating. According to recent UN World Water Development reports, global water demand is projected to exceed supply by approximately 40% within this decade if current consumption patterns continue. The crisis China faces today is a preview of what many nations will face tomorrow. With about 2/3 of the world's population expected to live in water-stressed regions in the near future, the struggle for control of fresh water resources will only intensify. Water, not oil, has become the resource shaping the geopolitics of the 21st century, and China has methodically positioned itself to control the tap. The silent crisis unfolding across Asia represents a new kind of threat, not a spectacular explosion of violence, but a slow strangulation of life itself. With each passing day, the vice tightens. More dams are built, more rivers are tamed, more nations find themselves dependent on China's goodwill for their most basic needs. The world's attention remains fixed on traditional security threats, nuclear weapons, terrorism, conventional wars. But while we look elsewhere, the foundation of civilization itself, fresh water, is being weaponized. History teaches us that resources have always driven conflict, but water is different from gold or oil or land. You can live without gold, you can adapt to life without oil, but without water, there is only death. That's what makes China's water dominance so dangerous and so effective. It doesn't need to fire a single shot to bring nations to their knees. It simply needs to close the sluice gates. The countdown has begun. The dams are built. The strategy is clear. The only question that remains is whether the world will wake up before the rivers run dry. But what do you think? Is China's water empire a legitimate response to its own crisis, or a dangerous power grab that threatens global stability? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more insights into the geopolitical forces shaping our world. Now go watch 17 facts about China's collapse that seem fake but are 100% real. Or enjoy our video on China's collapse into poverty is worse than you think.
The world's most powerful dam holds back 39.3 billion cubic meters of water. That's enough to flood entire countries, enough to reshape coastlines, enough to end millions of lives in a single night. China's Three Gorges Dam stretches 2,309 meters across the Yangtze River, the longest river in Asia, the third longest on Earth. Behind it sits a reservoir that reaches 600 kilometers inland, a body of water so massive that NASA calculated its weight actually slows the rotation of the planet by 0.06 microseconds per day. This is the largest power station ever built. 32 main turbines generate 22,500 megawatts of electricity. A wall of concrete 185 meters tall, holding back a force that never stops pushing. For decades, Beijing called it the crown jewel of Chinese engineering, proof that the party could bend nature itself. But nature has a long memory, and the cracks, both literal and structural, are spreading. The sediment is building, the earthquakes are increasing, the margins are shrinking, and the economic heartland it was built to protect now depends entirely on a single wall that was never designed to last forever. The world's most powerful dam isn't just infrastructure, it's a loaded weapon. and what was built to protect China may become the force that destroys it. To understand how China ended up here, holding a nation's future hostage behind a wall of concrete, you have to go back to the beginning, to a dream that was always as much about politics as it was about engineering. The dream started over a century ago. In 1919, Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, first proposed damming the Yangtze to tame its deadly floods and generate power for a nation that was still reeling from centuries of imperial collapse. It was visionary. It was also impossible, at least at the time. Mao revived the idea in the 1950s after catastrophic floods killed over 30,000 people across the Yangtze in 1954. The floodwaters submerged Wuhan, a city of 8 million, for over 3 months. The Jingguang Railway, one of China's most critical transport arteries, was knocked out for more than 100 days. Soviet engineers were brought in. Plans were drawn up, but political chaos, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, it all kept pushing the project into the future. For decades, the dam existed only as a blueprint and a political football, revived whenever leaders needed a symbol of national ambition, shelved whenever reality intervened. It wasn't until 1992 that the Chinese government finally put it to a vote, and what happened next was extraordinary. In a political system built on unanimity, 177 delegates voted against the dam. Another 664 abstained. Nearly one-third of the National People's Congress, an institution designed to rubber stamp the party's decisions, refused to endorse the project. It was the largest act of legislative dissent in the history of the People's Republic. Engineers warned about seismic risks. Ecologists warned about extinction cascades. Hydrologists warned the design would underestimate the Yangtze's fury. They were overruled. Premier Li Peng, a Soviet-trained engineer with deep personal investment in the project, pushed it through. The dam would be built, the dissenters would be silenced, and within 2 years, the most ambitious construction project in Chinese history was now underway. Construction began in 1994. Over the next 12 years, workers would pour 28 million cubic meters of concrete into a gorge that had carved itself over millennia. They built the largest hydroelectric structure on Earth, bigger than Itaipu in Brazil, bigger than anything that the world had ever attempted. The reservoir flooded over 630 square kilometers of land. 13 cities, 140 towns. They all vanished beneath the waterline. More than 1.3 million people were uprooted from the only homes they'd ever known, forced to rebuild their lives on higher ground, often without adequate compensation. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were erased from the map. Archaeological sites dating back thousands of years were submerged before they could be fully evacuated. The human cost was staggering, not just in numbers, but in the erasure of identity, history, and belonging. And in the process, they turned a living river into a regulated machine. But the price wasn't just political, it was biological. The Yangtze wasn't just a river, it was an ecosystem that had evolved over millions of years, one of the most biodiverse freshwater systems on the entire planet. The dam didn't just disrupt it, it killed it. The Baiji, the Yangtze River dolphin, had survived for 20 million years. It outlasted ice ages, continental shifts, and the rise and fall of entire civilizations. But in 2006, an international team of scientists conducted a 6-week expedition across the full length of the Yangtze to find a single surviving individual. They searched 3,400 kilometers of river, and they found nothing. The Baiji was declared functionally extinct, the first large vertebrate driven to extinction by human infrastructure in modern history. But the Baiji wasn't alone. The Chinese paddlefish, a species that predated the dinosaurs, sometimes growing to 7 meters in length, was formally assessed as extinct in 2020. The Yangtze sturgeon, once thriving in the tens of thousands, collapsed to near zero wild populations. The Chinese alligator retreated to a handful of shrinking habitats. The river's entire food web didn't just weaken, it unraveled, link by link. And the damage extended far beyond individual species. The dam blocked migration routes that fish had followed for millennia. Spawning grounds were severed from feeding habitats. Downstream water temperature shifted because the reservoir released water from different depths than the natural river. The entire biological rhythm of the Yangtze, seasonal floods, sediment pulses, temperature cycles that every organism depended on, was rewritten by engineers in a control room. And then there's the sediment. Before the dam, the Yangtze carried roughly 500 million tons of silt downstream every year. That sediment fed the delta, replenished wetlands, and sustained agriculture across a region that feeds hundreds of millions of people. But now, the dam traps the vast majority of it. The downstream delta is eroding. Saltwater intrusion is creeping inland. Poyang Lake, China's largest freshwater lake and a critical stop on migratory bird routes across East Asia, has experienced repeated severe low water crises. Satellite imagery shows it shrinking to a fraction of its normal surface area during dry seasons, exposing vast stretches of cracked lake bed where water once sat meters deep. The river's heartbeat was replaced by a mechanical pulse, and what the dam gave China in control, it took from everything downstream. But what you've seen so far is just environmental damage. What comes next is structural. If you've been learning something on this deep dive, subscribe now, because the next section explains why this isn't just about ecology, it's about national survival. When you fill a valley with 39 billion cubic meters of water, the valley will push back. Within years of the reservoir's first filling, seismologists began recording thousands of small earthquakes in the surrounding region, a phenomenon known as reservoir-induced seismicity. The sheer mass of water pressing down on geological faults that had been stable for centuries began triggering tremors the area had never experienced before. The 2008 Sichuan earthquake, which killed nearly 70,000 people, struck just 500 kilometers from the dam. While the direct link remains debated among scientists, the proximity raised uncomfortable questions about whether the massive redistribution of water weight was destabilizing geology far beyond the reservoir's immediate banks. Studies also link the sharp uptick in seismic activity directly to the filling and drawdown cycles of the reservoir. But the earthquakes weren't the only warning sign. Landslides, massive ones, began occurring along the reservoir's 600-kilometer shoreline. In May 2009 alone, between 20,000 and 50,000 cubic meters of rock plunged into the flooded Wuxiao Gorge of the Wu River. In the first 4 months of 2010, authorities documented 97 significant landslides. The valley walls, subjected to constant cycles of rising and falling water levels, sometimes fluctuated by 30 meters between seasons, and they were slowly destabilizing. Each cycle loosened the geology a little bit more. Each year, the slopes weakened. Engineers estimated that the reservoir's banks contained over 5,300 dangerous sites, places where the rocks could give way without warning, sending walls of debris crashing into the water below and generating waves that could overtop sections of the dam itself. INSAR satellite monitoring, the same technology used to track tectonic plate movement, detected measurable deformation along the reservoir's banks. The ground was literally shifting under the weight of what China had built. And then came 2020. During the worst monsoon season in decades, 5 consecutive flood waves slammed into the dam between June and August. The Yangtze Basin received its highest precipitation since 1961. Rivers and lakes across southern China would swell past their floodlines. Over 63 million people were affected. At the peak, floodwater poured into the reservoir at 75,000 cubic meters per second, the highest inflow since construction. The water level surged to 167.65 meters, just 7.35 meters below the dam's absolute maximum of 175, less than 8 meters between containment and catastrophe. To prevent a breach, operators opened the floodgates and deliberately released massive volumes of water downstream, pushing outflow to 49,400 cubic meters per second. They were causing the very flooding the dam was built to prevent. They had to create a flood to stop a worse one, and downstream hundreds of millions of people braced for impact. And even then, the margins were razor thin. The dam did hold, but the message was clear. In a bad enough year, it may not. That year, the dam's operators publicly admitted to what they called slight deformation in peripheral sections of the structure. Social media across China erupted with speculation. The government scrambled to reassure the public, insisting the deformation was within design parameters, insisting the structure remained sound. But the admission itself was unprecedented. In a system that never shows weakness, the cracks were becoming impossible to hide. But geology isn't the real vulnerability. The real vulnerability is what this dam holds together. The Yangtze River doesn't just flow through China. It's the economic spine of modern China. The Yangtze River economic belt spans 11 provinces and municipalities, from Chongqing in the mountainous west to Shanghai at the river's mouth on the East China Sea. As of 2024, the single corridor accounts for 47.3% of China's entire GDP. And that number has been climbing, up from 42% just a decade ago. Nearly half of the economic output of the world's second largest economy flows through, alongside, or depends on one river system. This is the world's busiest inland waterway. Over 4 billion tons of cargo move along the Yangtze every year, more than the Mississippi, the Rhine, and the Danube combined. Shanghai's port, sitting at the downstream end of this corridor, handles more containers than any port on Earth. Over 50 million units in a single year. The factories, refineries, power plants, and logistics networks that line the Yangtze produce everything from semiconductors to steel, pharmaceuticals to consumer electronics. Wuhan, Nanjing, Chongqing, megacities of 10 million or more people each, all sit along the Yangtze corridor. The automotive industry, the chemical sector, rare earth processing, agricultural heartlands producing a third of China's grain, all threaded along this single river system like beads on a string. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Despite being the largest power station on Earth, the Three Gorges Dam now supplies less than 1% of China's total electricity demand. The country's energy appetite has grown so explosively that the dam's 22,500 megawatts, once considered world-changing, barely register on the national grid. So what is the dam actually for? Flood control, navigation, keeping the economic heartland stable enough to function. The dam's real value isn't the electricity that it generates, it's the catastrophe that it's supposed to prevent. A single piece of infrastructure holding together an economic corridor worth tens of trillions of yuan. If the river would flood uncontrolled, the losses wouldn't be measured in billions. They'd be measured in percentage points of global GDP. Every container ship waiting to dock in Shanghai, every factory in Wuhan drawing cooler water from the Yangtze, every rice paddy in Jiangxi irrigated by its tributaries, all of it depending on a river system that's regulated by one dam. That's not strength. That's a single point of failure. And the most dangerous failure isn't a breach, it's a narrowing margin. Every year, the dam ages. Every monsoon season, sediment accumulates behind the wall, slowly reducing the reservoir's flood storage capacity and increasing pressure on the structure. Turbine blades erode from grit-laden water. Concrete degrades under decades of cyclic thermal and hydraulic stress. And climate change is intensifying rainfall across the Yangtze Basin, producing the kind of extreme weather events the dam was never designed to handle at this frequency. What was once a century-level event is becoming a decade-level reality. The margins aren't collapsing overnight. They're tightening, slowly, steadily, irreversibly. And China has been here before. In August of 1975, Typhoon Nina stalled over Henan province and dropped a year's worth of rain in 24 hours. Over 1,000 millimeters fell in 3 days. The Banqiao Dam, designed to withstand a once-in-a-thousand-year flood, faced a once-in-2,000-year event. Communication lines went down. Upstream gauges went dark. And just after 1 a.m. on August 8th, the dam gave way. A wall of water 7 meters high and 10 kilometers wide tore across the flatlands at 50 kilometers an hour. It shredded villages while people slept. 62 dams failed in a chain reaction, one after another, like dominoes. Roads, bridges, railway lines, they were all obliterated across an area the size of Connecticut. The official death toll was 26,000. Independent estimates, including from 8 senior members of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, put the number at 230,000, because most didn't die from the initial flood. They died from what came after. Communication with the outside world was destroyed. Over 10 million people were stranded in contaminated floodwater with no food, no clean water, and no way out. Relief teams couldn't reach the worst-hit areas for 2 weeks. Airdrop supplies would miss their targets and rot in the water. Famine and epidemics swept through the survivors for months. The Chinese government classified the entire disaster as a state secret. The full details weren't declassified until 2005, 30 years later. Built by the same system, managed with the same opacity, defended with the same assurances that the engineering was sound. Now scale that logic to the Yangtze. A catastrophic failure at Three Gorges wouldn't just flood farmland. It would paralyze the economic corridor that produces nearly half of China's GDP. Power grids would cascade into a blackout across multiple provinces. Ports would shut down. Supply chains that feed global manufacturing, from iPhones to industrial chemicals, would cease overnight. The downstream devastation would reach all the way to Shanghai, a city of 29 million people sitting at sea level at the mouth of the Yangtze. Global insurance markets would face claims on a scale that had never been seen before. International shipping routes that depend on Chinese exports would grind to a halt. This isn't prediction. This is consequence analysis. And the consequences, well, they don't require a full breach. Even a partial failure, a controlled emergency release like 2020, but larger, could trigger economic shockwaves felt on every continent. And you'd think, after all this, China would stop building megadams. But they didn't. They doubled down. In July of 2025, China broke ground on the Midog Dam, a hydroelectric megaproject on the Yarlung Tsangpo River in southeast Tibet. When completed, it will be the most powerful dam ever built on Earth by a staggering margin. 60 gigawatts of installed capacity, triple the Three Gorges, an estimated cost between $137 and $168 billion, making it the single most expensive infrastructure project in human history, designed to produce 300 billion kilowatt hours of electricity annually, enough to power nearly 300 million people. Beijing has framed it as essential for the country's green energy transition and for powering the explosion of AI data centers across China. The project was approved in December of 2024 and broke ground barely 7 months later, a pace that alarmed engineers and geologists who argued that the environmental and seismic site studies were dangerously incomplete, and they're building it in the most dangerous terrain imaginable. The Yarlung Sangpo carves through the Himalayas and the Great Bend, a geological wonder where the river plunges nearly 3,000 meters in elevation over just a few hundred kilometers. This is one of the most seismically active zones on the planet. The region sits directly on the collision boundary between the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates, the same forces that built the Himalayas and continue to push them higher every year. Major earthquakes are not a risk here, they're a certainty. The dam site sits roughly 30 kilometers from the Indian border, and downstream, the Yarlung Sangpo becomes the Brahmaputra, the lifeline for hundreds of millions across northeastern India and Bangladesh. India has called China's plans a red line. The potential for water manipulation, whether intentional or through catastrophic failure, threatens to turn a river into a geopolitical weapon straddling two nuclear-armed nations. Bangladesh, one of the most densely populated countries on Earth, with over 177 million people, depends on the Brahmaputra for drinking water, agriculture, and fishing. Any significant disruption to the river's flow could displace tens of millions in a country with almost nowhere left to go. China built the world's most powerful dam to control a river, but instead, it concentrated an entire nation's risk just behind a single wall. The ecology collapsed, the geology shifted, the economics became dependent on it, and the margins, they kept shrinking. Now Beijing is doing it again. Bigger, higher, in more seismically violent terrain, over a river shared by countries that already have their fingers on the trigger. We've seen this pattern before. Ambition outpacing engineering, political urgency overriding scientific caution, a system that punishes dissent, building structures that demand honesty about risk. The Yangtze doesn't care about a 5-year plan. The Yarlung Sangpo doesn't care about GDP targets. Rivers don't negotiate. They don't wait. They only know one direction: downhill. So what do you think? Is China engineering its future or engineering its next disaster? Let us know in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because we are just getting started.
For centuries, Russia had one unbeatable ally. Not its army, not its economy. The cold. General Winter crushed Sweden. It buried Napoleon. It shattered Hitler. And for generations, Russia built its identity around the idea that when everything else failed, winter would always save it. But this time, the cold didn't turn on Russia's enemies. It turned on Russia itself. As winter deepens, Russian cities are freezing in the dark. Boilers are exploding. Highways are gridlocked for days in sub-zero temperatures. Entire regions are losing heat, not because of foreign attack, but because the state can no longer function. The same winter Russia tried to weaponize against Ukraine is now exposing something far more dangerous. A hollowed-out country stripped of manpower, drained by war, and held together by propaganda instead of infrastructure. This video breaks down how Russia's most reliable advantage became its quiet executioner, why General Winter no longer saves the Russian state, and how decades of corruption and one catastrophic war turned cold weather into a threat Russia can't survive. Because when a nation can't keep its own people warm, the collapse has already begun. Russia made a promise to its people, an unspoken contract that's existed for centuries. You give us your loyalty, your sons, your taxes, your silence. In return, we keep you alive. Not comfortable necessarily, not wealthy, but alive. Through wars, purges, famines, and revolutions, that contract held because of one guarantee: the Kremlin could always deliver. When the thermometer drops to -30 and the snow piles higher than a man's head, the state will keep you warm. Heat in your apartment, lights when the sun sets at 3 p.m., roads you can actually drive on. It's the most basic function of government in a place where winter lasts 9 months, and being outside for 20 minutes can kill you. The Russian state could fail at almost everything else, but it couldn't fail at this. That's what made General Winter Russia's ally for so long. Not just on the battlefield, but in the social contract. The message was clear: outsiders can't survive our cold, but we can. We're built for this. The cold protects us. December 2025 shattered that promise. Not in Moscow, where the elite huddle in their heated towers. Not in St. Petersburg, where tourists still marvel at the frozen Neva. But in the places that matter, the industrial cities of Siberia, the highways connecting east to west, the regions that have bled the most for Putin's war. The first crack appeared in Angarsk, but it wasn't a crack, it was a chasm. December 7th, 2025, Angarsk, Siberia. Population just over 220,000. Temperature -22 degrees Celsius during the day, -32 at night. At the Combined Heat and Power Plant number 9, the facility that keeps the entire city alive, the second main boiler finally gave up. Not from Ukrainian sabotage, not from terrorism, from age. Decades of deferred maintenance, stopgap repairs, and bureaucratic indifference caught up in a single catastrophic failure. The plant went dark, and with it, 167,000 people lost heat and electricity. More than half the city, in the coldest month of the year. Think about that number for a second. 167,000 people. That's not a neighborhood, that's not a district. That's an entire city suddenly plunged into Arctic conditions with no way to keep warm. Within hours, apartment radiators turned ice cold, windows frosted over from the inside. Not the pretty kind of frost you see in fairy tales, but thick, opaque sheets of ice creeping across the glass. Water pipes began to freeze and burst, flooding apartments and then freezing the water into solid blocks of ice. Hospitals scrambled to keep patients alive with emergency generators that weren't designed to run for days. Kindergarten stayed open because parents still had to work for the war economy that caused the mess in the first place. Teachers wrapped children in blankets during nap time. In some apartment buildings, residents broke the rules and huddled together in stairwells, combining body heat. The elderly living alone in high-rise apartments were the most vulnerable. Some didn't make it. One mother speaking to independent Russian media captured the desperation. What are we supposed to do with small children in -30 degrees? Adults can endure it, but the babies? Officials tell us not to use electric heaters because the power grid will collapse. So how are we supposed to survive? She even wrote a personal letter to Vladimir Putin, a plea from one freezing apartment in Siberia. Here's what Putin was doing while her children shivered in their winter coats indoors. Boasting about Russia being the world's 4th largest economy, announcing new military operations, projecting strength on state television. Back at Angarsk, residents filled social media with rage. Putin talks about palaces and summits while we freeze in the dark. How do we enter Putin's fantasy world where everything is perfect? Because we're not living in it. Mayor Sergei Petrov declared a state of emergency. But declarations on paper don't melt ice. They don't restart boilers that are decades past their service life. They don't bring back the engineers who were mobilized and sent to die in trenches near Bakhmut. The city set up temporary shelters for about 6,000 people, but 167,000 were freezing. The math doesn't work. It never did. And everyone in Angarsk knows exactly why. For 3 days, families huddled in single rooms. Children slept in their winter coats, hats, and gloves. The lucky ones had grandparents with wood-burning stoves. The unlucky ones prayed the power would return before their pipes burst or their children got hypothermia. This is the 21st century. This is a nuclear power. This is the country that claims to be challenging NATO and the United States for global dominance. And it can't keep a Siberian city warm in winter. But here's the part that cuts deeper than the cold. This isn't new for Angarsk. One resident told reporters, "Last year we went without heat for 3 days at minus 50 degrees. The year before that, the pipes froze for a week. Every winter something breaks, and every winter they promise it won't happen again." The promise is always broken, because the people who could fix it are gone. But Putin didn't just betray Angarsk. He bled Siberia dry long before winter came. Let's talk about Irkutsk Oblast and the Republic of Buryatia, two Siberian regions that most Russians in Moscow couldn't point to on a map. Economically vulnerable, politically voiceless, home to ethnic minorities and working-class Russians with no connections to protect them. These are the places that bore the brunt of Putin's mobilization. In late 2022, when the Kremlin called up reserves to replace the staggering casualties in Ukraine, these regions sent thousands. Not volunteers, conscripts, men who had no choice. At least 9,000 people from just Irkutsk and Buryatia were mobilized and sent to the front. 9,000 fathers, brothers, sons, and husbands. By late 2025, according to regional records compiled by independent journalists, 1,178 of them were confirmed dead. 567 from Irkutsk Oblast, 611 from Buryatia. Do the math. That's 1 in every 9 men mobilized from Irkutsk. 1 in every 7 from Buryatia never came home. These aren't statistics. These are bus drivers, mechanics, construction workers, plumbers, electricians, the backbone of every city when winter arrives. These are the men who knew how to fix a frozen water main at 3 a.m., who could operate a snowplow in a blizzard, who understood the old Soviet heating systems because they'd been maintaining them for decades. Every single one of them is irreplaceable, and they're gone. Dead in muddy trenches outside Bakhmut or Avdiivka, or any of the other meat grinders where Putin throws men to hold a few hundred meters of frozen dirt. Their families received coffins, when they received anything at all. Some got a payout, a few 100,000 rubles, maybe 1 million if they were lucky. Blood money that doesn't begin to cover the loss. And meanwhile, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, elite families make sure their sons get university deferments, medical exemptions, or cushy government jobs far from the front lines. The children of oligarchs don't freeze in trenches. The children of government officials don't get their names read on lists of the dead. The social contract was always unequal, but it was never this obscene. Siberia gave everything and got nothing back. Now, as winter tightens its grip, the consequences are playing out in brutal clarity. In Kazan, the wealthy capital of Tatarstan, a city that hosted the BRICS Summit and World Cup matches, Mayor Ulser Metshin made a stunning confession in November 2025. We know how to host BRICS Summits and World Cup games, but the first heavy snowfall makes us look like a team of underachievers who can't do anything. Kazan is short 100 snow removal specialists. They can't find anyone to fill the positions. In Ufa, the capital of neighboring Bashkortostan, the situation is even worse. 1,180 municipal positions remain unfilled. Half of the city's public works staff is simply gone. Where did they go? They're in Ukraine, or they fled the country to avoid conscription. Or they're buried in anonymous graves marked with wooden crosses. The men who operate snowplows, repair heating systems, fix burst pipes, and keep the roads passable in minus 40 degrees, they're not there anymore. Putin took them for his war. And now, when the boilers explode and the roads freeze and the power goes out, there's nobody left to fix it. In Vladivostok, a major Pacific port city, where temperatures were a relatively mild minus 3 degrees, 6,000 residents still lost heating due to equipment failure. In cities across the Urals, transformers blew out from overuse, causing cascading blackouts. Many of these transformers were imported from the West in the 1990s and early 2000s. The companies that made them no longer support them. The replacement parts don't exist. In Chita, a major heating pipeline burst earlier in 2025, flooding streets with boiling water that immediately froze into bizarre ice sculptures around parked cars. It took weeks to repair. In Nizhny Tagil, residents endured repeated power outages as the electrical grid stretched beyond its limits, simply gave up. This is happening everywhere, not just in one unlucky city, not just one bad winter. This is systemic collapse playing out in slow motion across 11 time zones. Even in Yakutsk, the coldest city in the world, where winter lasts 9 months, the first snowfall in September somehow came as a surprise to municipal authorities. One resident summed up the absurdity. Every year, winter comes unexpectedly for our city services. The roads turn into ice rinks. Buses are delayed for hours. In a place where being outside for 20 minutes can be deadly, a delayed bus is a life-threatening situation. This isn't incompetence, it's systemic collapse. But wait, it gets worse. On December 1st, 2025, a blizzard hit the Baikal Highway. This is the Trans-Siberian route, one of the most critical transportation arteries in Russia, connecting Irkutsk and Buryatia to the rest of the country. Heavy snow, high winds, temperatures around minus 30 degrees. The highway should have been cleared immediately. Snowplow should have been deployed. Emergency services should have been ready. Instead, a 100-kilometer traffic jam formed. 100 kilometers! That's 62 miles of vehicles trapped on an open highway in sub-zero temperatures. Hundreds of trucks, hundreds of cars, families with children. For 3 days, they sat there, engines idling to provide heat, burning through fuel. Food running out, no toilets, no shelter. Parents wrapped their children in every piece of clothing they had and prayed their fuel wouldn't run out before help arrived. Some people tried to drive on the wrong side of the road in desperation, risking head-on collisions just to escape. Others abandoned their vehicles and tried to walk to nearby villages. Local authorities eventually set up a few warming stations and brought some fuel trucks, but only after critical hours had passed. The Federal Highway Agency, Rosavtotor, blamed the drivers. Of course, the government always blames the people. Reckless truck drivers violated traffic rules and caused accidents. But the drivers tell a different story. No snowplows arrived for an entire day. No police. No emergency services. Just silence and snow and temperatures dropping. One driver told an independent outlet, "To put it plainly, it was a complete disaster. We were abandoned. They left us to freeze and hoped we'd figure it out ourselves." This is Russia in 2025. A country that launches hypersonic missiles and threatens nuclear war can't clear a highway in Siberia. Because the workers who would clear it are dead or at the front. Because the equipment is broken and the parts can't be replaced. Because every ruble that could have prevented this disaster went somewhere else. And here's where it went. In 2024, the Russian government allocated nearly 40% of its entire budget to defense and national security. 40%! That's more than the European Union and United Kingdom combined spent on defense in purchasing power parity terms. In 2025, the Kremlin earmarked 13.5 trillion rubles, roughly $134 billion, just for national defense. For context, the entire federal budget for infrastructure, housing, and utilities combined is a fraction of that. Regional governments are left scrambling for funds to maintain basic services. The cost breakdown is brutal when you do the math. A single S-400 air defense system costs about $500 million. That money could modernize the heating systems for dozens of cities like Engarsk. A single Su-35 fighter jet costs about $85 million. That could replace every piece of snow removal equipment in Kazan, Ufa, and a dozen other cities. The cruise missiles Russia fires at Ukrainian power plants? Each one costs several $1,000,000. Fire a dozen of them, and you've just burned through the budget that could have kept 167,000 people warm in Engarsk. Meanwhile, the infrastructure that keeps people alive? Crumbling. The boiler that failed in Engarsk was installed in the 1970s. It was supposed to last 30 to 40 years. It's now 2025. You do the math. The district heating systems across Russia were built during the Soviet era and are decades past their design lifespan. The power lines, water mains, sewage systems, all of it is running on borrowed time. And instead of replacing it, the Kremlin builds missiles. Let's put this into perspective. The cost of a single Kinshal hypersonic missile, the kind Russia fires at Ukrainian cities to knock out heating plants, could have completely overhauled the boiler system in Engarsk. One missile, 167,000 people would still have heat. But Putin made a choice. He chose to weaponize winter against Ukraine instead of protecting his own people from it. And now the infrastructure is collapsing faster than it can be repaired. Here's where it gets even worse. Russia can't fix these problems anymore, even if it wanted to. Why? Sanctions. Before 2022, when a Russian power plant needed new turbines, control systems, or high-tech components, they imported them from Germany, Sweden, or France. Companies like Siemens, ABB, and Schneider Electric supplied the industrial equipment that kept Russian infrastructure running. Now, those companies have left. Export controls block the sale of critical technologies to Russia. The Kremlin is cut off. Sure, they can try to smuggle parts through third countries or use inferior domestic substitutes, but it's expensive, slow, and often doesn't work. Even when parts are available, there's another problem. The skilled engineers who could install and maintain them are gone. Thousands of Russian engineers, IT specialists, and technicians have fled the country since 2022. They don't want to work under a repressive regime. They don't want to be drafted. And the ones who stayed? Many are now in uniform, serving at the front instead of maintaining power plants. So Russia is stuck in a vicious cycle. Infrastructure breaks down more frequently. Repairs take longer. Temporary fixes become permanent risks. And every winter, General Winter presses down harder on this brittle, failing system. But while Russia froze at home, Ukraine struck where it really hurt. Russia tried to weaponize winter. Ukraine weaponized reality back. Starting in 2023, Ukrainian forces escalated a drone campaign targeting the one thing that funds Putin's war machine: oil. Not the battlefield, not the soldiers, the money. It was a calculated strategy. Russia's military runs on oil revenue. Without petrodollars flowing in, the war grinds to a halt. Ukrainian drones began hitting oil refineries, storage depots, and pipeline pumping stations across Russia. Deep strikes, hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory. Facilities in Rostov, Krasnodar, Ryazan, Tatarstan, and beyond. Some attacks were surgical, taking out specific distillation units or storage tanks. Others started massive fires that burned for days. Each strike sent a message: Ukraine can reach anywhere. The Novoshakhtinsk refinery in Rostov was hit multiple times. The Ilsky refinery in Krasnodar, one of Russia's largest, suffered repeated drone swarms. The Ryazan refinery, just 200 kilometers from Moscow, went up in flames. By mid-2025, the damage was staggering. According to data compiled by Reuters, at least 17 major refinery installations were struck in the first 10 months of 2025 alone. By October, roughly 40% of Russia's total refining capacity was either offline or damaged. 40%! That's not a minor disruption, that's a strategic catastrophe. Russia, one of the world's largest oil producers, suddenly couldn't refine enough fuel for its own needs. Gas stations in rural areas started running low. Lines formed. Prices spiked. The government downplayed it, of course. They ramped up output at undamaged facilities. They drew down reserves. But the damage was done. By late 2025, Russian oil export revenues had plummeted. Gazprom's gas exports to Europe fell to their lowest level since the early 1970s. According to the Moscow Times, citing Reuters data, Russia exported only about 18 billion cubic meters of pipeline gas to Europe in 2025. That's a 90% collapse from 2018 levels. Meanwhile, the United States imposed direct sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. The European Union agreed to a full ban on Russian LNG imports by 2027. The noose is tightening. Putin tried to freeze Ukraine into submission by attacking its power grid. But Ukraine adapted, decentralized generation, backup systems, generator entrepreneurship. Every cafe, every office, every hospital bought its own generator. You can flip the main switch, but you can't shut down a million small power sources. Meanwhile, Ukraine kept burning Russia's refineries. The winter Russia tried to impose on Kyiv came home as a financial deep freeze in Moscow. General Winter didn't betray Russia, Putin did. The cold doesn't pick sides, it just reveals the truth. And the truth is this: Russia built its identity on the myth that winter would always save it, that the cold was an unbeatable ally, that no matter how bad things got, the state could at least keep its people alive when the temperature dropped. That contract is broken. In Angarsk, 167 people froze because the state couldn't maintain a boiler. On the Baikal Highway, families nearly died because the state couldn't clear the road. Across Siberia, cities struggled through winter without the workers who were sent to die in Ukraine. And in Moscow, Putin projects strength while refineries burn and gas exports collapse. This isn't just infrastructure failure, it's the collapse of the social contract that holds a nation together. When a government can't perform its most basic function, keeping people alive in winter, the center cannot hold. History is full of empires that fell, not with a dramatic bang, but with a slow, grinding erosion of the state's ability to deliver on its promises. The Roman Empire didn't collapse in a day. It decayed over decades as roads went unrepaired, aqueducts crumbled, and the legions could no longer defend the borders. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of war, it collapsed because the system could no longer provide what people needed to survive. Empty store shelves, broken promises, a government that demanded everything and delivered nothing. Russia in 2025 is following the same path. The signs are everywhere. Cities freezing in the dark, highways turned into death traps, workers sent to die in a war that serves no one but Putin's ego, infrastructure collapsing faster than it can be repaired, and a government that responds to every crisis with propaganda instead of action. Putin wanted to go down in history as the man who restored the Russian Empire. Instead, he may be remembered as the man who presided over its disintegration. The irony is almost poetic. For centuries, General Winter defeated Russian enemies. Now, General Winter is exposing Russia's greatest weakness, a state so consumed by war and corruption that it can't keep its own people warm. The cold that once saved Russia is now revealing the rot within. And when spring comes, when the snow melts and the ice thaws, we may find that more than infrastructure has collapsed. The trust between the Russian people and their government is freezing over, too. So what do you think? Can Russia survive this winter? Not just physically, but as a functioning state? When a nuclear power can't keep its own cities warm, when it sends its workers to die in a losing war, when it prioritizes missiles over boilers, how long before something breaks for good? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to keep tracking how empires fall, not with invasions or revolutions, but with frozen pipes and empty highways, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We follow the collapse nobody else is covering.